right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our September 27th, 2023 meeting. I'd like to call us to order, and prior to our minutes, let's please take a moment of silence to remember our fallen brothers and sisters across our country, including our military. All right, thank you very much. We have a full schedule today.
Yes.
Yeah, and I'd like to thank our team here in Olympia from our left board for doing all their work, and appreciate their guidance as we move forward. So our first item of business is the approval of our minutes from our... Thank you, Senator. I don't know who got the second, but second was made. So the minutes were posted. Motion's been made to adopt. Discussion. Any discussion on the minutes? Comments? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right, our minutes are approved. Thank you very much. Our first item of business is item number 2, which is a report from our financial condition. And Frank, I believe you're in the room. So if we could, you want to give a background, way background?
This, every year or every other year, the board receives certain reports from the Office of the State Actuary. One of those in a non-rate setting year is a report on the financial condition of the plan. And it's kind of in tandem to the next item on the agenda, which is has to do with the long-term economic assumptions for the plan. So here today from the Actuary's Office to present the report on financial conditions is Frank Serra. Frank, welcome.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. It's good to be here in person with you all. I was saying to some of my coworkers, it's been a while since I gave an in-person presentation, so it's good to be back in the groove of things. So yes, for the record, my name is Frank Serra. I'm a senior actuarial analyst for the Office of the State Actuary. I am very excited to be here with you all today and presenting on the 2023 report on financial condition. All right, so today's presentation, we'll be tackling it in 4 steps. We'll start with some background on the Report on Financial Condition, or RFC. From there, we'll transition to the current health and then the projected health of the retirement plans. And finally, we'll close with some financial risks to the retirement plans. And at this point, I do want to note, I keep saying retirement plans. I'm referring to all of the DRS plans in aggregate. That's the focus of this report. However, I know, of course, left to plan is certainly of the most interest to this board. So throughout the presentation, I will be making a handful of call outs to what some of these measures look like specifically for left to. So the RFC, what is it? Yeah, it really, you can think of it as kind of a pulse check of the financial health of the retirement plans. We study it in odd numbered years, and we study it jointly with the economic experience study, which you'll be hearing about in our next presentation. For this year, this presentation will serve as our RFC, and its focus will be on changes in plan health since our last RFC analysis in 2021. Now, when we measure plan health, how do we do that? Well, we do it primarily through 2 different metrics, and you can see them here on this slide. Those metrics are affordability and solvency. So affordability refers to the ability of pension plan contributors, that would be members, employers, local government, and the state, to pay the necessary dollars needed to fully fund the retirement plans. On the other hand, solvency refers to the ability of the plans, of the pension plans, to pay member benefits when they become due. And I love this little graphic in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide. It's one of my favorites, our little balancing act. And it's appropriate because affordability and solvency, managing them together, is a balancing act. As an example, if you have a plan that you're looking to boost its solvency, you might consider raising contribution rates, but then that comes at the risk of the plan's affordability. So there is a give and take going on between these two metrics. And with all that context in mind, we're now ready to dive into the current health of the retirement plans. We'll start with the affordability metric. And as you can see from the table there to the right of this slide, we're looking at total employer contribution rates by plan. So the column to the furthest right is the contribution rates that have been adopted for the current biennium, and then to the left of that, we have the rates that were collected over the prior two biennia. And if you sort of scan across each of these rows, you'll notice that the contribution rates are either staying steady or coming down over that time period. Left two certainly is in that bucket as well, the second row from the bottom there. And however, if you look at the first four rows, PERS, TERS, SERS, and PSERS, those have the biggest decline over that time period. And the reason for that is some recent funding policy changes that have been decreasing the Plan 1 UAL rates they pay, the unfunded actuarial accrued liability. So those rates are only applied to those plans. Those rates have been coming down, which is why you see those systems contribution rates declining. But the contribution rates for generally for all plans are coming down too because of the recognition of deferred asset gains over time. This next slide focuses a little bit more on those Plan 1 UAL rates. Again, those are applicable to PERS, TERS, SERS, and PSERS. Not so much the left two. So not going to spend much time on this slide. The only thing I will note, if it's of interest, in the table to the bottom there, the contribution rates over the 23-25 biennium, because of law changes, those have come down a fair bit for the PERS 1 and TERS 1 UAL. So just some context regarding how other pension plans in Washington State's contribution rates are reacting. We'll keep the focus on affordability, but come at it from a different angle. Here we're looking at contributions as a % of the general fund state or GFS budget. This once again is all retirement plans combined. And if you look at the graph, you'll notice that in about starting around 2003, since that point, the pension contributions have been comprising a greater and greater share of the GFS budget. They've been generally on an upward trajectory through 2020 when they peaked at around 6.5%. But then since that time, pension contributions as a % of GFS budget have been coming down, and that parallels what we saw on the prior slide, contribution rates coming down recently. This measure has been coming down as well recently. So we talked about affordability, and again, on the other side of the balancing pole is solvency. So we're going to shift our focus there next. And we do so with the help of the funded status metric. As a quick refresher, funded status is the ratio of a plan's actuarial assets to its earned or accrued liability. So, for example, if you have a plan that is 100% funded, that means that they have $1 in actuarial assets for every dollar in earned liability. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. And here on this slide, we're graphing the funded status of all the DRS plans combined. And what we see is since around 2016, the funded status of the DRS plans has been improving. In 2016, that combined funded ratio was around 84%, and then in 2022, it was around 96%. In the appendix, though, we have it broken out by individual retirement plan, including LEF 2, so you can kind of see how each of the retirement plans falls on this spectrum. For LEF 2, in 2016, the funded status was 105%. It's been climbing since that point, reaching 113% in 2020. So similar, increases we're seeing for the rest of the plans. Then in 2020, it dropped a bit, corresponding to the benefit improvement bill that passed a year or two ago. But since that point, it's been climbing again. So this is our recap slide for what we've covered so far. In a nutshell, affordability and solvency for all the DRS plans combined continues to improve. It's in a good spot right now. And that's great news, but it's certainly natural to then wonder what would these measures look like on a projected basis? Where are we headed in the future? And that is the focus of the next portion of our presentation. I'm going to be walking through the slides just for symmetry in the same order as I just did for current plan health. So we'll start with employer contribution rates, then we'll move to contributions as a percent of GFS budget, and then we'll look at funded status. But please do keep in mind these are projections. So unlike what we just looked at over the past couple slides that were actual historical information, what you're about to see are their forecasts based on actuarial assumptions and plan policies as of the time of this measurement. So we start with the affordability metric once again, looking at contribution rates. And this table is intended to have a similar feel to the one we looked at a couple slides ago. But the big difference is when we last saw this table, we were looking backward in time. We were looking at historical rates. Now we're trying to look forward. We're trying to see what the future might hold. And what we see is that for all the retirement plans, the total employer contribution rates are projected to decline over the next several biennium. The reasons for this are once again, for PERS, TERSERS, and PSERS, they're seeing the payoff of their unfunded actuarial accrued liabilities for the plans one. That's expected to happen in 2027. And then for all of the plans, they are still recognizing large deferred investment gains.
Frank, are these measurements using the aggregate funded method?
These are aggregate for, so it's plan specific. PERS, TERSERS, PSERS, State Patrol use aggregate, and then LEF 2, of course, their entry or their minimum rates are based on the entry age funding method, to your point. All right, next up, we're going to revisit pension contributions as a percent of GFS budget. So the left side of this graph, to the left of that vertical green line, is the historical information. I just carried over the same line graph we saw a couple slides ago. And the information to the right of that vertical line, that's the new information. That's our projections. And what we see is a little bit of a jump there in 2023. That's due to a $250 million lump sum payment to TERS 1 to help pay off their unfunded liability. But then after that, we see a continual decline in how much of the GFS budget is being taken up by pension contributions. And then last but certainly not least, we revisit funded status. And here it's some more good news. On a projected basis, the funded status of all the DRS plans combined are expected to continue improving into the future, with each plan expected to reach or exceed 100% funding within the next 5 years, which is fantastic news. As for LEF 2, have that information here. At 2022, LEF 2's funded status came in at roughly 104%, and then on a projected basis over the same time horizon, we expect it to go north of 110%. I know as part of a future presentation, and Mitch DeCamp will be speaking more to projections, so I'll leave it there for the moment. Right, so once again, recapping what we've covered so far. Affordability and solvency, as we said, for all DRS plans combined, it's currently in a good spot. As we just saw on a projected basis, it's also looking like it's in a good spot. And it's great news and something certainly worth taking a moment to stop and appreciate and be proud of. However, I have to be that person. Remember, when we talk about projections, as much as it pains me to say, they may not play out exactly as we expect. Actual experience will come along and it'll play out differently than what we anticipate. And because of that, we also have to be vigilant of some of the financial risks to the pension plans. In our 2021 RFC, we take a deeper dive into some of the factors that materially influence our projections. These three are some of the bigger ones in our opinion. Investment experience, assets that perform materially better or worse than we expect. Choices made by policymakers, benefit improvements or changes in funding policy that weren't expected at the time we performed the measurement. And then demographic experience, members that live longer or retire earlier than we expect. Again, more information on those items can be found in the 2021 RFC. But for today, just going to focus on some of the big movers since the time of the 2021 RFC. And as I mentioned, we're looking at the RFC across all DRS plans. And when we do that, two of the bigger changes happen to be in the plans one. Some larger laws that passed recently that impacted the affordability and solvency of those plans. If we're looking specifically at LEF 2, though, one of the bigger changes recently has been that benefit improvement bill. Approved, member benefits. It created new minimum contribution rates. It capped contribution rates for the 23-25 biennium. The impacts of that are, once again, it improves member benefits. It helps with short-term affordability and contribution rates. But one of the potential trade-offs of that is, an impact potentially to long-term affordability or solvency. But it's a pension plan, right? There's always going to be risks. It's unavoidable. But each risk also presents an opportunity. And it begs the question, how can these risk factors be managed? well, we know we can't control everything, unfortunately, right? We can't control things like the investment market. We can't control pandemics. But there are some things that are within our control. The legislature and policymakers can manage some of the risks by adopting adequate contribution rates, adopting reasonable assumptions. As a reminder, we'll actually be looking at the assumptions, the economic assumptions, as part of our next presentation. And OSA plays a role in this process too. We revisit our assumptions regularly, and we perform actuarial analysis on proposed plan changes. And all of these steps taken together help put the plan in a better position to manage financial risk. So here's my closing slide. In a nutshell, for all of the DRS plans in aggregate, affordability and solvency are improving and on a good path, but they require regular monitoring, timely action, and prudent discipline to ensure they remain in a good place. More information regarding this presentation, disclosures, things of that nature can be found in the appendix, but at this time, that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Questions? Anybody? All right. Thank you for that. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, get to be the bearer of good news. That's all.
Yeah, wasn't bad. Wasn't bad at all.
As Frank mentioned, there are two financial reports that OSA presents every 2 years to the board. The second of those is the state actuary's recommendations on long-term economic assumptions. Those long-term economic assumptions would be adopted by the board. And here today, we have the state actuary, Matt Smith, to discuss his recommendations, and Frank is here with him as well. With that, I will turn it over to you, Matt.
Thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone. Great to see you. Great to be here in person. As Frank had said, we've been working from home a lot, so it is so quiet in here. You can hear like a pin drop. Where's the barking dog, right? If you listen to music, right? Can somebody murmur a little bit? It's okay, by the way. It reminds me of like being on the first tee at the golf course, right? Make some noise. Doesn't bother me. But yeah, thank you. I'm going to walk through this report. Similar to what Frank said earlier, this is for all the retirement systems. We do look at each plan. These are economic assumptions that we typically think are going to, the same conditions apply to all the retirement plans, but I'm sure you may have some questions in that regard, especially with general salary growth. So Frank's going to drive for me because he's way more capable. Little background. So we're going to talk about background. Frank, we're going to tag team this. I'm going to introduce this. Frank's going to talk about a couple assumptions. I'll talk about 2 assumptions as well. We're sharing key takeaways from the report that we did. It's available on our website if you want to dig in deeper. Of course, we love to answer your questions in the moment, after the presentation, whatever you prefer. Spoil the lead here. No recommended changes from the current assumptions that you've adopted, the ones that are in law. But we will walk through that in detail. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Frank to cover 2 assumptions, and I'll cover the last 2.
Thanks, Matt. All right, I'm going to start with just some quick background on the economic experience study. Like I mentioned for the RFC in my prior presentation, the EES, Economic Experience Study, we conduct that every other year in odd-numbered years. And its focus is on the long-term economic assumptions of the plan. For left 2, that would be the 3 assumptions you see there in the boxes to the left. Alongside them, we have the purpose, how OSA uses each of those assumptions. And there's just, at this point, a couple quick notes I wanted to make right off the top. We'll be diving into each of these assumptions in more depth in the coming slides. But up front, I wanted to mention inflation because That one, we're studying inflation in the Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue region, a very specific region. And the reason we do that is because the COLA, the cost of living adjustment, for Left Plan 2 is based on inflation in the Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue region. So that's why we're kind of zoned in on that region. And then the other item I wanted to mention is investment returns. That's our biggie. In terms of actuarial plan funding, that is the most material of these assumptions, and we'll be devoting a fair number of slides to that topic.
And Frank, I'd forgotten, I mentioned I was going to talk about two assumptions. Actually, I'm going to talk about one. We removed one. We also have to study membership growth for Plan 1 funding, but that only applies to PERS 1 and TERS 1. So we removed it from this presentation since it's really not germane to your plan. So save you some time on that one. So.
Thanks, Matt. All right, so this economic experience study is the result of many months of analysis by our office, and there's a number of key considerations that go into it. On this slide, I'm just going to talk through a handful of those key considerations. The first one is the purpose of the assumptions. In this case, our purpose is to use the assumptions for actuarial funding to develop sound contribution rates for both members and employers, among other things. Another consideration is the measurement period. So for plans that are still open to new members, like Left 2 is, we're focused on a measurement period of roughly 20 years. And that 20-year period represents the midpoint, if you will, of when we expect all plan liabilities will be paid out on a present value basis. So 20 years from now, we expect about half of Left 2's liabilities to be paid, and then the remaining half will be paid after 20 years on a present value basis. That's for current members. And yeah, this is an important one to keep in mind because it is a longer term horizon, right? 20 years. So, of course, each year will be different. In some years, there may be large salary increases, extravagant inflation. And to account for that, OSA does have the ability to make one-year adjustments to our valuation to capture significant deviating experience if it's warranted. Moving along, we look at relevant data, we look at forecasts for the future, and we look at historical data as well. But we do place greater emphasis on the forecasts because at the end of the day, we are trying to set forward-looking assumptions. We abide by actuarial standards of practice, which provide our profession with guidance, even guidance on things like studying economic assumptions. And then finally, we apply our professional judgment. There's a lot of science that goes into this analysis, but there's a lot of art too, right? These are uncertain and volatile economic assumptions that we're dealing with here. And we can't say for sure what the future is going to hold. And so this is where we apply our professional judgment of what we think are appropriate economic assumptions. All right, so enough belaboring the point. It's time to dive into those economic assumptions, and we'll start with inflation. In this graph, what you're seeing are national inflation forecasts by a variety of experts in the field. We have the Congressional Budget Office in blue, the Economic Revenue Forecast Council in orange, the Social Security Administration in yellow, and others. And each of these forecasts, of course, they're a little different. Each of the lines has its own path to it. But in general, what we see is that the forecasts are typically higher in the short term and then trend closer to 2.3 to 2.5% in the long term. And as another point of reference, the Washington State Investment Board also studies inflation. Their 15-year average inflation assumption is 2.5%, so they're right in that range as well. All right, that is national inflation. But if you recall from a couple slides ago, we're more focused on regional inflation in the Seattle-Tacoma-Bellevue area. And so we're going to turn our attention there next. What you're seeing here is the differential of the two. So if you take Seattle-Tacoma-Bellevue inflation and subtract out national inflation, you get that blue line there. And as you'll see, that blue line since about 1990 has mostly hovered above 0%, indicating that that differential is that, the Seattle-Tacoma-Bellevue inflation outpaces the national inflation. What will that look like in the future? Of course, that's the million-dollar question. We'd love to have forecasts that are focused on the Seattle-Tacoma-Bellevue region and for our DRS plans in particular, but unfortunately that information isn't readily available. So we look at this historical information, and moving forward, we expect that discrepancy to continue, but how long, of course, is the million-dollar question. We have no reason to believe, though, that right now, over the next few years, it'll be going away altogether.
I have a question. So, can you give us an idea of why the Seattle-Tacoma-Bellevue inflation is generally higher than national inflation? Is it because of the economic growth in Seattle, or?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The economic growth in Seattle certainly historically has outpaced that of the national average. It's also home to some of the biggest companies in the world. You have Amazon, you have Boeing, Microsoft. So all of these kind of drive inflation. There's other factors, of course, as well contributing to that, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Yeah, I think, remember, we looked in this in the report, I think housing was another real reason why it's outpacing national inflation. And, given the uncertainty, too, that we're all seeing in the short term as well, I think this, even though we're looking at these things in separate components, national and then regional, it gives us a little bit of room to manage some of the uncertainty when you stack these two on top of each other. So I know it can be hard to assume in perpetuity that our area will outpace the nation, right? You would think somewhere down the road it would come back down, but for these measurement periods, I feel pretty comfortable keeping it at its current level, and for that uncertainty, and to recognize we might have some short-term higher inflation as well.
All right, so to recap some of the things we've talked about with inflation, we expect national inflation to be 2.3 to 2.5% in the long term, but we expect regional inflation to outpace that a little bit. We've seen that the Federal Reserve is committed to bringing down inflation. In fact, recently we've experienced a decline in inflation over the past few months. And all that taken together brings us to the state actuary's recommendation of a 2.75% regional inflation assumption. That's consistent with the recommendation from the 2021 EES, and it's consistent with the board's current adopted assumption. All right.
One other, quick thing to add to, we think about in context of the modeling here for LEF Plan 2 and for all the other open plans. This assumption is primarily informing the post-retirement cost of living adjustment, which is capped at 3% under current law. So when Frank was talking about if we see really high levels of inflation, we can make an adjustment to assume 3%. If this is impacting banking, the banking provision in the COLA that I think you've talked about, we can also start reflecting that banking might be more likely in the short term. And so there's a difference between, like, this is sort of like your underlying long-term inflation assumption, and then we have the ability in the evaluation to make adjustments for things like banking, or if we think it's more likely that we're going to have a 3% COLA for the next 3 years. Just want to, make you aware of that. And when we talk about general salary growth later, that's one where if we're seeing larger salary increases due to inflation, you don't have necessarily that cap, to manage it. So, yeah, a lot of considerations when you think about not only setting the assumption, but how do you model it in your actual evaluation. So this is one where, yeah, a lot of uncertainty, but how it would flow through the valuation is not as concerning. LEF Plan 1 is the only plan that has an uncapped COLA, right, fully indexed to the CPI. So LEF 1 is where we really keep an eye on, well, what if we do have, 8% again, or 6%, or 5, 6, 4? Yes, fortunately, that plan is very well funded. So, yeah, just wanted to give you a little more context on how we're managing inflation and how it impacts the valuation results. Not as concerned about inflation and when it comes to modeling the liabilities of the plan. And Frank can talk a little bit more on the next slide about general salary growth. There's some give and take on that one as well.
Thanks, Matt. So yeah, next up, we are going to head to general salary growth. And before we dive in, though, I just want to clarify what exactly we're looking at here, what assumption we're studying. And the reason I want to clarify that is because OSA studies total salary growth in two different pieces. We study an economic piece and we study a demographic piece. The economic piece, that's what we refer to as general salary growth. That's taking into account inflation and market conditions, things of that nature. And that assumption is constant across all DRS plans. The counterpart to that is the demographic bit. We call that the service-based salary growth. That's where we're picking up things like merit, longevity, promotions, those sorts of salary increases. And that's the one that varies by retirement system. So the demographic assumption that we assume for the LEF Plan 2 will look different than the demographic assumption we assume for PERS or TERS. And just to kind of follow up on that point, if, as an example, for LEF Plan 2, if you take a member that has 3 years of service, we're going to, based on our current assumptions, assume that they'll receive 3.25% salary bump next year due to economic forces. We'll assume that they receive 6% due to the service bit. And so together, we'll actually expect that member to receive closer to 9.5% to 10% salary increase in the year. But again, remember, for today's presentation, we're only focused on that economic portion, the general salary growth bit.
Another question for you. Does that have anything to do with the difference in the statute for LEF members having interest arbitration versus the general other groups that don't have interest arbitration? Does that play into it at all?
No. So are you referring to the economic assumption or the demographic, or both?
Both.
Both.
Does the interest arbitration in the statute have anything to do with either one of those in terms of LEF Plan 2 or LEF 1, but specifically LEF 2 versus other groups that don't have interest arbitration under the law in Washington?
No, it's a good question, but it's not a material consideration for this assumption. Yeah.
Mark, we look at the data, so we don't have necessarily the source of the increase. So if it's, if that is impacting salary growth, we're going to see it with the actual data and then have to determine, does that feel more economic? Does that feel more demographic? It's not a perfect science by any means. But the main point here is just, I think there's always sort of initial reaction to this assumption of like, man, that just seems really low. Because it's not modeling all the sources of salary increase. It's just we're trying to pick out the economic piece. We're going to also model the demographic piece. And there's probably a little bit of crossover between the two. You don't have perfect data to identify which one's purely economic, which one's purely demographic. In total, we wanted to model it reasonably well.
So do you get that information from DRS in terms of what the salary growth actually is for the different plans or the members in the different plans?
Exactly, but it'll just be, like this person, this is their salary. This was the pensionable salary for the year, and we can compare it to the prior year, and we can look at their years of service, and that's how you can pull out the demographic part. The economic part is more of just stepping back and looking at it at a macro level and saying, what's going on with inflation? If salaries are supposed to keep up with inflation, they don't always, but if they're supposed to, that's kind of giving you an indication of how you might model general salary growth. There's usually salary growth above inflation, so you're making an assumption there. So, two assumptions in our model. We're just talking about the economic component today.
So I have another question, a follow-up question. Do you ever get questions by legislators about the interest arbitration provisions in the law when it comes to what your forecasts are? Is that something that legislators are interested in, or they ask that question?
I don't recall any, when we provided this type of presentation in the past, I don't recall any questions about how interest arbitration impacts our assumption.
Okay, thank you.
Frank, can I follow up on one of your points?
Please do.
You had made a comment about taking like a third-class firefighter or police officers. They progress up through the ranks, maybe the third year on the job. And many of our departments through police or fire, maybe they might have 4 or 5 steps before they reach that top step level. Because I know you're looking at this from a broader statewide. Is that common? Because I know that you have, in the state government, you have bands and you have different levels. Is that the same kind? I mean, you're diving into each individual and kind of looking at that. Is that the way you do this?
So we look at it across an entire retirement system. So all of PERS, all of TERS, all of SERS. And the general trend, what we see for LEF 2 and for the other retirement systems is that in early years, they have really high annual salary growth. I think, demographic salary growth. For LEF 2, for instance, I think we assume it's like 11 or 12% when they're first starting out that their step increases will be. And then over time, those step increases drop. They each drop at different rates. So LEF 2 may drop at a slower or a faster rate than the other plans. But LEF 2 is certainly starting at a higher annual salary growth than the other plans.
Right. And then I think you mentioned one of your slides that you have as they top out at that level right there. Then you'll see part of your evaluation, you'll see like the longevity step come into it, where somebody maybe 10 years on the job, then you see a different bump or promotions, things like that based upon time. Are you seeing right now, because we know that we have such a huge turnover in both police and fire, that we have so many new people coming in that there's going to be potentially greater increases, but they're also starting at a lower wage?
It's a great question. It's something that we dive much more deeply into in the demographic assumption when we study that portion of it. Matt, I don't know, you were involved in the AVER this year. I don't know if you can recall off the top of your head if we were seeing.
I definitely was involved in it. Certified it too. So Dennis, so the short answer to your question is yes, right? So, when that new person comes in, yep, we're gonna use their reported salary, which usually is lower, right? If they're brand new, and then they're gonna go through this merit scale, right? Where we're gonna then apply much higher salary increases because they're year 1 on the job, right? Year 2 on the job. That scale is based on what we've seen in the past, that scale for merit, and we revisit it regularly to see how it's changing for interest arbitration or a new collective bargaining agreement. If you become aware of significant changes in payroll practices, please let us know. Those are the things we're we're looking out for, because our goal is to model compensation as closely as we can. We know it's such an important part of the valuation. One other quick thing, since I've off mute, if you will. We also understand, there's all different types of employers, police and fire. This is an assumption that we feel is appropriate on average for the entire population. We are not trying to model, like for this employer, this is the best assumption for their firefighters, and for Seattle, this is the best assumption for their law enforcement officers. That would turn our work into an excruciatingly slow and painful process. So we are trying to set an assumption that overall fits for the entire population. I think it does. And what's tricky here is we're talking about just the economic component of salary growth. And I think maybe a couple of years, we'll be coming back and talking to you about what the demographic part's looking like, because we look at that every 5 to 6 years and update that assumption.
Thank you. Good.
Quick question, either one of you. Is OSA notified when a left-to employer does a wage study?
No.
Okay. Thank you.
So as I'm looking at the salary-based growth, the service-based, salary growth, and you take into account merit and longevity, but within, I'll just take the police departments, they have lots of different ad pays. In my department, you could get an extra 3% if you speak a second language. You get an extra 3% if you're working in detectives, or there's lots of different ad pays, and I'm sure that varies amongst departments around the state. In fact, I know it does. So how do you, that can take any individual officer could make significantly more than another officer depending on their educational experience and other things that they take into account. So how do you take those into account?
It's going to get blended into sort of general demographic experience. And I don't know if this is too detailed, but I'll give you just a quick broad brush. So we're going to get, we get compensation records on every member in the system, that's being paid a salary. And we're going to look at it over every year in our study and every year of service. Like we can bucket it by everyone who had 1 year of service during the study, who went from 0 to 1. What type of increase did they have? Somebody who went from 1 to 2 years of service, what type of average increase did they have? We will pull out what we think is the economic sources of salary growth. What was inflation over that period? What was our idea? What's our sense for any increases above inflation? You pull that out, and you're left with everything else is a source of salary increase that we did not think was economic. And that could be because of longevity. It could be exactly what you just described. Does it apply to every person in the plan? No, sure it doesn't. But we're kind of stuck having to just sort of come up with a blended assumption that we think will apply appropriately to the entire plan. And again, we're getting the total data. We're getting the total increase, but we're not getting the source of the increase. We're not getting a report that says this person got a promotion. This person got an increase due to a CBA or what'd you say, ad pay. We're not receiving that data, but we're seeing that this person made, 100,000 last year, and this year they made 110. We have to then determine what's economic and what's demographic to put it into our model and make an assumption. But we definitely monitor this one closely, and it is also reassuring to get data on every member in the system and see the compensation over their career. We're now trying to, at a point in time, estimate what we think their future compensation is going to look like based on what we know today. This person's, 22, and they've got 10 years of service. Got to project them into the future. Pick up the pace on that.
All right, so moving along with general salary growth, what you're seeing here is, a general salary growth, it's volatile from year to year. So to help, look at that data a little bit more easily, we average it out over various time periods. What you're seeing here is averages of general salary growth for the open DRS plans over the past 10, 20, 30 years. We're noticing a decline in the general salary growth there, but it's staying within the range of about 3.2 to 3.4%. for left two, is in a similar bucket. Over the last 10 years, I think their salary growth was close to 3%. Over the last 20 years, 3.5%. So staying relatively within that range.
And again, this is the economic
Yes.
portion.
Okay, we're going to dive a little bit deeper now into general salary growth. We think of general salary growth as inflation plus a real wage growth component. And that real wage growth component is really just any economic factors other than inflation. We spent a couple slides looking at inflation already, so now we're going to focus on that real wage growth component. And as much as we'd like to look at real wage growth for just the Seattle, Tacoma, Bellevue region, for just left two, unfortunately that data isn't available to us. So we go for the next best thing, which is national level data. It's not perfect, it has some limitations to it, but what we're seeing is based on 10-year projections for real wage growth, it's remained pretty steady over the past 2 to 4 years on a national level, suggesting not a lot of movement in that real wage growth component. All right, so closing out the general salary growth assumption. Sorry.
The national data, is that by any chance broken out by occupation? So do you have like data projected real wage growth for law enforcement or projected real wage growth for firefighters, or is this more projections for all workers nationally?
So the latter, it's for all workers nationally. The forecasts we looked at were from the Social Security Administration and the Congressional Budget Office. Those were the two organizations, but yes, they do look at all workers.
Steve, we did find a source on government employees, and we'll look into our records again on what we were able to find, if at all, for police and fire. And of course, if you are aware of any forecasts on wage growth for those populations, love to see it too. I don't recall us finding any, and I thought the closest we could find was something on government employees.
More anecdotal. That's why I was curious whether you had found something.
So okay, all of those considerations taken into account, the state actuary recommends a general salary growth assumption of 3.25%. Once again, that's consistent with the recommendation from the 2021 EES, and it's consistent with the assumption currently adopted by the board. And again, lastly on this note, as Matt mentioned already, if we become aware of large salary increases or decreases in a single year, we can reflect that in our evaluation of 1-year adjustment if it's warranted.
Yeah, I always appreciate these opportunities to chat with you too, because in some areas, I will admit, it's a lot easier to keep an eye on. Like a few years ago, it's probably more than a few. You may recall that the teachers negotiated like really, really large pay increases. That's publicized. It's very easy to see. It might go through the budgeting process. So maybe it was like, on average, they were getting a 15% pay increase. So we put that into our evaluation once we knew it had been adopted, to model that 1-year salary increase. For state employees, that their increases go through the state budget. That's also very publicized. So just reinforcing the relationship here that if you can share information with us that you're aware of any sort of outsized increases in salary due to new pay practices or collective bargaining agreements, we'd love to hear that.
I got one for you right now. So in the state of Washington, in my profession, body cams have become extraordinarily popular. So it's a CBA item with us. My agency just finalized theirs. And I would say right now it's anywhere between 2 to 5%, depending on your agency. And statewide, by the end of next year, I would estimate about 75% of law enforcement agencies in the state of Washington will have body cam programs, which all have wage increases.
So playback, you wear it, you get paid extra. Okay. Very good to know, thank you. Especially if it's becoming widespread.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah, it's growing exponentially, and it's not specifically required by law, but it's strongly encouraged depending on the size of your agency and what your demographics are, size of the community you serve. There's a lot of different factors there, but it's definitely on the rise, and nationally actually, but specifically state of Washington, most definitely.
Appreciate that. It sounds like we'll have some follow-up with you, especially when we look at the demographic. I think we're going to start our demographic experience study next year. So, if you have time for it, we'd love to preview some of that and have some conversations with you.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, and that concludes our comments on the general salary growth assumption. Next, we're going to move to investment return, and for that, I'll be passing it off to Matt to walk us through.
Mr. Chair, how are we doing on time? Okay. This is the last assumption, as Frank mentioned. It's a biggie. A few more slides, but I think warranted. And this next slide is really more of a framing slide about the things I'm going to be talking about. Capital market assumptions are a key input to this process of recommending a return assumption. I will probably refer to the CTF multiple times. That is the commingled trust fund. Your plan's assets, like every other plan, and the DRS administered plans are invested in the CTF. We'll talk about the target asset allocation in the CTF, how the assets are invested. Pretty important when we're doing this type of work, obviously, to check in on that. We look at simulated investment returns, a whole bunch of scenarios. What do the investment professionals, what do they think the CTF will return in the future? Sensitivity analysis, I think you've heard this before, actuaries do this quite a bit. That's just showing you if something's based on assumptions, like these simulations, how could they change if you change key assumptions? And then lastly, we're looking at something that's based on investment. It starts as an investment exercise. It's used for asset allocation purposes, but we're using it to set an assumption, potentially for a longer time frame. So we need to make sure that whether or not we need to make adjustments to SIB's assumptions or analysis for our purpose. So that's a framing slide. Now we'll walk through each one of those. So capital market assumptions come to us from the State Investment Board. We really appreciate that and the partnership. Time horizon, 15 years. So when we talk about the capital market assumptions, just kind of put that, hold that in your brain for a bit. 15 years is they set that assumption, 15-year period is how they use it. So that's one of our first check-in points. We've already talked about, we might use this beyond 15 years. So we have to be aware of that and see if these are appropriate for that purpose. The behavioral stuff here is risk, reward, and relationship. So risk is the volatility, right? How much these asset classes move year over year. High returns usually are associated with, higher expected returns, right, are usually associated with higher volatility. Standard deviation. The reward is the return component, like the expected 1-year return on that asset class. Private equity, real estate, global equity. Each one of them has a capital market assumption. The relationship is how do they work together? Do they move in the same direction? Are they a diversifying asset class? Do they potentially move in the opposite direction? So that's why those assumptions are really critical for recommending a return assumption. So with that background in mind, how have these capital markets changed since our last study? So on this table here, there's a lot of data here, but I'll highlight sort of the key things here. First of all, we're looking at the expected 1-year returns, the current study and the study we did 2 years ago, and the standard deviation, sort of that risk component. The risk side hasn't changed much at all. As you can see that in the difference column, almost every asset class remained unchanged from a risk perspective. On the return side, again, 1-year returns, you'll see increases to fixed income and cash, Primarily, that comes from higher interest rates, that we're seeing, the Fed managing higher levels of inflation. So the asset classes that are more directly tied to interest rates, you're seeing a corresponding increase in capital market assumptions. I think it's all reasonable, all what you would expect. It's also very reasonable to see these capital market assumptions change every couple of years because investment markets are evolving, they're dynamic. Target asset allocation. So what is the mix of LEF 2's assets, if you will, the target mix in the CTF? That also can change from study to study. So SIB looks at this pretty regularly. Since our last study, they made a few minor adjustments. They moved 2% away from global equity and put it into private equity. So now private equity is 25% target instead of 23%. And then they moved 1% of the fixed income portfolio to tangible assets. May not have been played out exactly the way I've summarized it, but that's sort of the general takeaway of how things are moving. So with that, and with this and with, so moving some of the assets to higher performing asset classes and looking at the CMAs that we did earlier, this would lead you to believe that returns are going to be a little bit higher, which is what you've got on the next slide. So simulated returns, you take those capital market assumptions and you look at the target asset allocation, then you can do a lot of simulations, right? Like what might these returns look like? Thousands of simulations under different economic conditions. You can sort them from highest to lowest and summarize them. And we look at the median return. That just means that half the returns, if I talked about 1,000 simulations, half are above that and half are below that. So the median 2 years ago for the CTF was about 6.9%. And then this study, we're looking at a median return of just barely over 7%. So it's now even more in line with the 7% assumption, which provides certainly a lot of comfort, from my perspective. Again, not surprising to see this based on what I said earlier. Higher returns because of interest rates. Some of the assets being moved to higher performing asset classes. So I talked about these simulations and sensitivity analysis. So yeah, they are based on, all those simulations are based on capital market assumptions, right? Assumptions can be wrong, like Frank said. It's just sort of the price of doing modeling, if you will, and setting assumptions. So we looked at how would that median return change if we changed the 1-year return for 2 asset classes. So we looked at private equity and global equity. And you might wonder, well, why? Because those are 55% of the asset allocation. 30% target in global equity, 25% target in private equity. So what happens if you were to change just the expected 1-year return for those asset classes? We looked at 1% higher and 1% lower. And it moves the median down to 6.8 roughly, or as high as 7.3 on the upside. And that's not to suggest that somehow we don't have confidence in SIB's assumptions. It's just really to give you a sense for how significant are those assumptions. And I mean, it's material. Certainly 0.3 is meaningful for a pension system. But it also doesn't, in my mind, doesn't blow your doors off, right? Like, oh my goodness, are we talking about 6? Are we talking about 9? No, we're talking about probably about 0.3. And from a perspective of an approximation, I think it makes sense, right? Because we talked earlier about global equity is 30% of the portfolio. If you have 1% higher returns, that's 0.3. If it's 1% lower, right, it's negative 0.3. Private equity, 25% target, right? 1% higher returns, that's 0.25. So you're seeing numbers that are very, reasonable in relationship to how the assets are invested. And all we're doing is saying, what if the expected return were 1% higher or 1% lower? So meaningful, but hopefully, giving you some confidence that the 7%, seems like a pretty reasonable assumption, even when you test some of the assumptions. And +1, -1 is a pretty big adjustment to those 2 asset classes. Significantly more pessimistic or optimistic. Next slide. Talked about adjustments, and just do a quick, this is just sort of I've already sort of introduced this, but we have to look at things like the purpose of the capital market assumptions and that was, they're developed for strategic asset allocation purposes. We're doing something for plan funding. SIB, 15-year time horizon for their capital market assumptions. We're looking at something as short as 8 for like left plan 1 and something closer to 20 when you're looking at left plan 2. So what happens when you extend these assumptions beyond 15 years? Do we have any concerns? Are they still appropriate? Frank mentioned that SIB has an inflation assumption, so do we. So consistency, do we have inconsistencies that we need to manage? SIB in their assumptions has a mean reversion component, and that just means that they look at things like valuations, right? Is the stock market looking like maybe it's overvalued, price to earnings? If it is, they typically will then have an assumption that's going to come down. And if it's the reverse, right, it would be coming up. So things like that, for an actuary, we have to kind of lean in and say, like, okay, are these things still appropriate for what we're wanting to do, what we're using these for? Do we need to make adjustments? So that's sort of like the background on why we're talking about this. On the next slide, I can share the conclusion in that we found the simulations to be reasonable and they're consistent. Even though we have different inflation assumptions, they're within the range that Frank noted. I think they're still consistent assumptions, even though they're different. And the adjustments that we talked about for different timeframes, they're kind of offsetting. In one area, we think we'd have to increase returns. In another area, we would have to lower the returns. And when you considered all of them, it kind of got us back to the same place. So with all that in mind, we're landing at the same place as we were 2 years ago. We think 7% is reasonable, it matches the current assumption, don't see a need to change it. We continue to look at the closed plans versus the open plans. There is a point, right? Who knows, I'll probably be retired by then, but there is a point where the duration of LEF 1 or PERS 1 and TERS 1 could be so short that you might want to consider a different assumption if it's a really volatile period. But right now, the same assumption for all the plans looks reasonable, but wanted you to be aware that we are looking at it by plan, open plans versus closed plans. Still looking reasonable to have one assumption for all. And the assets are all still invested in the same commingled trust fund as well. And I think, recap. The numbers here, right? So, they were on each slide, but now we can sort of present them together. So current assumptions are listed here, 2.75 for inflation, general salary growth, 3.25, 7% for investment return. Recommendation is no change. And let's see. The other thing, just as a reminder, we look at these as a set of assumptions. So if you didn't agree, and that's fine, if you didn't agree and you decided to make changes, just be mindful of like picking one assumption and changing it. You could develop an inconsistent assumption, right? Like, I want to change general salary growth. Well, we'd ask you, is that because of inflation or is that because of something else? If it's because of inflation, we'd say, well, why would you pick a change in one assumption and not the other ones? Because they all have an inflationary component in them. So just sort of like, be careful. It's not intended to be an a la carte menu, if you will. And I think that's it. Happy to answer any other questions that you have. Again, really appreciate the opportunity to present to you today.
Any other questions? Not seeing any. Matt, Frank, thank you very much. Good to see you both. Thank you for the information.
Our pleasure.
Thank you so much.
All right, Mr. Nelson, looks like we're moving on to item number 4.
Yes. So the Department of Retirement Systems has been working on an issue called Month of Death. And that has to do with the practice right now where during the month in which a retiree dies, they are entitled to receive only the prorated portion of the pension for that month, which requires DRS to go back and collect part of it usually. So Sean Merchant from DRS is here today to talk about that issue and in particular some ideas that DRS has regarding that issue. And with that, I will turn it over to Sean.
Morning, Mr. Chairman. For the record, Sean Merchant with the Department of Retirement Systems. appreciate the opportunity to come and talk to you about an issue that we have both, as organizations, worked on before. It's been a few years, but here we are again. I'd like to take a personal moment real quick and say hello to Daryl. I actually was at WACOPS, was that last week, speaking to them, and I thought, I wonder what Daryl's up to. Were you? Yeah, I'm sure. But it was a pleasure to see those folks again. But again, here to talk about what Steve teed up, which is conceptually we call it the month of death. It was an issue that was worked on by the board and the select committee with input and help from the department. Beginning, I think, 2019, it resulted in legislation that was sponsored by the Left 2 board and the select committee, and last was heard in the 2020 legislative session, made it to committee hearings, but just failed to kind of get over the hump at committee cutoffs. So we left it at that time and moved on to different things, but we think the time is right. We think the policy idea was a sound one, and what it is, as Steve explained, our current practice is and has been, I think forever, that if a retiree passes during a month, we will prorate the benefit that is paid to them. Oftentimes that is, actually most times now, it is electronically deposited in a member's account, and we will prorate the benefit and claw back, if you will, a portion of the benefit that represents the days in which the member was not alive in that month. And as Steve alluded to, that does create certain problems and workload issues for our department, but also the healthcare authority has issues that come up with that as well, because a lot of times retirees are paying things like retiree health care automatically deducted from their account. So if they don't get notified in a timely manner, the healthcare authority is trying to figure out how to get their bills paid when there's no money in the account, because we have proactively taken half of the money, say, out of it. So it creates a tremendous workload for the healthcare authority also. So really the proposal is quite simple. It would just end that practice so that if a member lives one day during the month and we pay the retirement benefit, that amount stays in the account. And most or a lot of other states do it that way. Social Security does it that way. We just think that it's kind of the right thing to do, and it's our current practice kind of is a hardship and in some senses penalizes a family beneficiaries at a time when they really don't need to be dealing with something like this at such a horrible time in their lives. So what I'm asking is, again, this measure is being worked on again by the Select Committee this year. We've provided the input to them, bringing it before you for your consideration. Also, I have worked with OFM to have the bill submitted through their system as an agency request piece of legislation. So unlike the previous bill, it would actually be by request of Department of Retirement Systems and so willing by your organization and the Select Committee. So that I'm available for any questions. Thought I'd keep it brief because we have talked about this before.
Questions?
Nobody?
We could think of something.
Think of something, anything.
Anything. No. Go ahead, Steve, you were going to say something. All right. I think that's it, yeah.
Okay, short and sweet.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Appreciate the time, and again, any questions in the future, I'm available.
You're going to stick around, aren't you?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, number 5 on our list. It's like more DRS.
So when the board was first created, the question at the time was who was going to administer the Left 2 benefits? And the decision was that the Department of Retirement Systems had been administering them since the creation of Left 2, and they were doing a good job, cost-effective and customer service. And so the decision at that time, both for the policymakers and for the Left 2 board, was to continue that practice. And then there would be an annual presentation from the department about how the administration of the benefits was going. Mark has probably delivered every one of those presentations over the 20-plus year history of the board, and he's here again with us today. Mark is the budget manager for DRS, but also their manager of performance, how they measure their performance. And I won't steal any of your thunder, but I will turn it over to Mark for the presentation this year. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, members of the board. Nice to be here. Yes, I have been doing all of these presentations over now more than 2 decades. We've been participating in this since the second year that CEM initiated this portion of their business. And I was listening to Matt's presentation earlier, and I heard him, one of the phrases he mentioned was an excruciatingly slow and painful process. And I thought he was getting ready to bring me up here to talk about public pension administration. But it's one of those things where if I didn't really enjoy it, I wouldn't have stuck around to do it as many years as I have. Now, the vendor that we use, I mentioned that they're a unique vendor. In fact, they are the only entity in the world that does public pension administration benchmarking. They started out in the 90s, actually the early 90s, to do investment management benchmarking for public plans. And they noticed this other activity off to the side. Well, what about administration? And it's a very interesting organization, a lot of curiosity. Some of the individuals that created the business, if you will, much more kind of academically oriented. So they got together some, professors, people that are really good in statistics, people out of the industry, and kind of created a think tank. So a lot of curiosity in this area, and it makes it a very unique and a very interesting organization to work with, because they're really trying to get down to, what is it that explains the differences. Just some of the brief elements here. They do have a very large business side, as if you will, on investment management benchmarking, but when they get into pension admin benchmarking, that's where I interact with them. They do benchmarking for the State Investment Board, so that other kind of branch of business they do work with SIB on. For the year that I'm providing data on, this was the fiscal year that closed June 30, 2022. I am currently busy filling out the survey for 2023 data, but the reported comparison here is for the participants in 2022. There were 64 that participated in this aspect of their business, the bulk of them from North America. You do see some international participants there as well, out off the continent. The one in Abu Dhabi, interesting side story there. They got into this a few years ago, and their primary interest in participating was to figure out, what are the best practices. They're trying to figure out, okay, what is this, public pension administration? Hey, there's this group out of Canada that does benchmarking. Let's get involved in their service and figure out, who's doing it the best, who's doing it right, what can we learn from them. Had a similar discussion with entity that represented the South African government at one of the conferences. They were joining for the same purpose. But one of the things that you won't see them in the data, because the data in the survey that I'll be presenting is just for the North American systems, because they're similar enough that CEM can, do a very long survey and get meaningful responses, meaningful data, so that they can do a comparison. When you start to get to some of these other international plans, they're really not comparable to the plans that we administer here in North America. And a lot of them tried to do the service in the survey, and what CEM found they had to do was really come up with a separate service and survey for them. Now, they still are available for discussions as far as best practice analyses and innovative ideas. I will, chat with them during some of the conferences. Some of the individuals, especially out of the United Kingdom, are quite interesting. The Dutch are also quite interesting to talk with as far as innovative practices. I mentioned the survey, that we've been filling out for the last 20 some odd years. It really is a great example of a continuous improvement project, because CEM does work with all the participants partially to get to something that all of us are willing to fill out. All of us understand how to fill out the right way, but they're constantly evolving that survey to make it more meaningful over time. I remember the years where we would go and argue with them about, hey, you're not capturing enough metrics about transactions that are done over the internet, over the web. Why aren't those being tracked? And we were one of the early adopters of that. And they just weren't up to speed on getting that, so they got work groups together, figured out what questions, what metrics they would need to bring in. In the most recent year, for the current survey, they've actually reduced the number of questions, because they went back, their statisticians went back and looked at the 1,000 that they were asking and started eliminating the questions that were essentially statistically meaningless. They didn't carry enough weight in any of the analysis. Why would you have it in there? They removed about 300. They did add, some additional kind of new questions to get into new areas of business. So it makes it more meaningful. If I were to, still be filling out and getting the same reports back we got back in the early 2000s, it would be of no business value. So they really are trying to capture that business value and evolve their business. Now, our peer group here, you see the North American systems out of the United States. The ones that are in the teal colored states, there are administrators there that are in our peer group, which is the larger U.S. systems, which is basically any U.S. system that has over 300,000 active members and annuitants. We are most similar to them for the statistics that are done, and it also gives them the right size of a peer group so that all their statistical analysis that they do is actually meaningful when they get into the data. The orange states there on this map have a participant in the service for this last year, but they're not big enough to get into our peer group. And then I don't have the Canadian systems in here because their systems are just different enough that they aren't counted in our peer group. Now, this becomes meaningful when you start to get into some of the scores and the charts that are in this presentation. Now, I'm going to talk about this real quickly about what you're seeing here, other than what the underlying data represents. When you see these charts, this is essentially all the North American systems that participated. The darkest column will be DRS. The medium blue columns will be our peers, which are the larger U.S. systems, and then the lighter blue columns are the other participants, which would be all the Canadian systems and the smaller U.S. systems. So this gives you kind of that quick visual, where does DRS sit relative to our peers and then everyone else that participates in North America. Now, the individual measures that I will be talking about here are what CEM calls composite measures. They're kind of the roll-up. So when you see this complexity score, which is a measure that gets at numerous aspects of complexity within public pension administration, you notice that our column is very close to the almost the maximum score for complexity. And what that captures there really is the fact that we're an umbrella administrator. We administer a lot of different public pension plans in the state of Washington, as opposed to some of the other administrators where you might have, California STRS. administers the plan for the state teachers. They don't have the public employees, they don't have law enforcement. There's a couple other plans that have all of them together. They will get kind of the same type of a score. But what they're trying to capture here is what are all those different rule sets, those different laws that you're having to administer. And interestingly enough, through the decades when CEM has been working on this, when they started out, they were trying to figure out, well, what is kind of the cause that causes someone to have a different administrative cost? And one of the avenues that they went down was it must be complexity, because they did have a couple of administrators with high complexity scores who were actually high cost. And they looked at us and it's like, well, you guys have a very high complexity score. We have a very low cost per member. Through the year, when they looked at this, they found, no, you don't get a nice, clean, linear relationship on all your data points. It's not if you're high complexity, you're high cost. If you're low complexity, you're low cost. That didn't pan out. So they started looking at other measures, other roll-up measures, and to kind of make a long story short there, even though I do have 45 minutes, I won't. They haven't been able to find one thing. There is no one magic bullet that explains, the cost per member differences between administrators. It in its own is very complex. And in this score, there was a very kind of humorous interaction during one of the conferences where the CEO at the time asked us, and he admitted on the complexity score, he goes, we don't have the granularity in this score to identify and kind of capture the differences between complexity that impacts the system in all aspects of administration versus complexity in our score that can be handled by kind of that small team of experts that can handle the one-offs. Maybe it's you're getting to your closed plans or your plans that only have a handful of members left to retire. Well, you've got your experts over here, they can handle those, and the rest of your new open plans, they're easy. But because your old plans are still kind of in the database, it makes your score look high. And after admitting that, Tom asked the question of the audience, okay, how many of you would be willing to fill out an even bigger survey for us to be able to get at that? Crickets. Nobody raised a hand. And then after nobody raising a hand, then you started to get that very genuine feedback from the audience. It's like, no, we're not filling out a bigger survey for this, because it would be kind of testing a bigger survey and then trying to get into it. We weren't really interested in that aspect of the survey. Now, on the score itself, you see that we are very close down there to the maximum. One of the other things I want to bring up here is that in this, at times, people will see who the other participants are, and they will ask us, well, hey, like on this chart here, where's Missouri? Where's Oregon? Where's Idaho? It's like, we don't know. The reports that we get back, we know where our point is, we know where our peers are, but they don't name each of the columns. They don't name each of the data points. That's done to kind of maintain the confidentiality with the other systems who participate, because there are some systems who identified years ago they wouldn't participate if essentially their bad position in some of these data elements were to be made public to the whole nation, essentially all of North America. They will work with their board on it, but they're not going to want to have that report get out. Now, over the course of the conferences, you will have people who will self-identify and will allow us to talk about, that they've self-identified. In this chart here, the highest complexity score actually goes to CalPERS. They have a very unique element in their administration, and it really is interesting in a way in that, you think of PERS here in the state of Washington, PERS plans 1, 2, and 3. California PERS, when they're administering PERS for all the public employers that have members in that system, PERS is not PERS. PERS can be very different, and it has to do with the fact that the employers have the capacity to actually change the structure of the benefits every year. Individual employers can change the structure of those benefits. So it makes their job very difficult. It makes the complexity, increases the complexity of their systems, probably drives their actuary crazy, the actuaries that they have, because it's potentially, I guess, trillions of different calculations are possible. That's just kind of one of the interesting asides in this for the different data points. Service score, this is a composite score as well. Now, when they measure service, they're measuring, I guess it's potentially like 80 different data points through the report. And what they're trying to get at here is, the obvious one, responsiveness. How responsive are you in numerous different types of transactions? They're looking at how many different ways a member can interact with you to perform a specific type of transaction, how available you are, the hours that your call center is open. They look at the different locations where you provide member counseling, one-on-one counseling. Do you have field offices? How many different locations you will do seminars? So it really is quite a composite score. Over the decades, DRS's data point in this has been kind of hovered around the median. We've never been tremendously high service according to their score, but we've always also never been tremendously low service in the composite. It's always been, kind of plus or minus a few points around the median. The comment that I have there on the slide is that our score last year was 71, so we were 4 points lower. We were able to bring that up through some additional work in staffing in the call center, as well as, I mentioned there, one-on-one counseling. When the score was captured in the previous year, essentially due to the pandemic, we shut down one-on-one counseling. There was no more in-person one-on-one counseling. That impacted the score. We're starting to get back to one-on-one counseling, but we also we initiated Zoom appointments for one-on-one counseling. That started to feed into the data score. CEM recognized needing to start capture that, so they added that question in. Oh, and on service, before I leave that topic, this was one of the ones where there was a similar discussion where, Tom talking at one of the conferences, he looked at service score and said, this isn't that magic bullet. It doesn't explain everything. They looked at the relationship. High service must be high cost. Low service must be low cost. That didn't pan out. So his request back to the group, he figured, okay, they don't like filling out long surveys. How about if we reduce the number of questions on service and we reduce the input or the output that we give you back? In this case, the response he got back from the audience was no. We want to know all that information about service, where we're different than the peers, how much we're different, where they might be doing something that we're not doing, especially because of the tie-in with cost. We can then find out, okay, who's doing something innovative? We can go talk with them. We're not in a competitive industry in this for administration. If someone has a great idea, I can go talk with them. They'll actually give me information on, okay, this is what we did, this is how we did it, potentially sharing software, sharing how they've designed something. So it's a great group to work with from that perspective. But the feedback that Tom got at that conference was, no, don't touch that. We love that area, of the survey and, of the information we get back, because that's kind of what we're really participating in this for. Now, total cost, this is where you see where DRS's column is way down to the left, way down in the lowest quartile for cost. They're at just under $64 per active member and annuitant, comparing to the peer median of 90 and the peer average of about 104. I note there in the orange text that our cost actually decreased by $14 from the 2021 survey, primarily due to the cost of major projects. Now, In total cost, this is also essentially a composite measure, if you will. CEM does drill down into cost. They will look at 30 different activities of cost. But when they get to total cost, the discipline there is, top line on the survey, how much did you report was your total administrative cost in your published annual financial report? That number goes in, and then they have kind of what gets them to apples. Okay, do you have any investment management administrative costs? Remove those out, because we're just benchmarking public pension administration. We're not benchmarking investment management. Do you have any discretionary or voluntary services also listed in your admin cost? In the case of DRS, we administer the state's deferred compensation program. That's a voluntary program that's not commonly administered by the state administrator or the local entity's administrator that's in the service. Pull that off to the side. If you administer health care benefits, pull that off to the side. They're really trying to get at what is that apples to apples in total. So the total cost, this is a fairly good number, kind of clean number for statistical comparisons. In this, you also see that I've done the inset, the line chart there that shows for the participants going back to 2015. You see that DRS has consistently been below the peer group there and below the all participant average as well. But you notice our line there kind of dropping down. And being somewhat of a statistics nerd myself, I always want to know, okay, why? Why did my line go down? Does it make sense? Is it something we did? Is it something that changed? Did I respond wrong? I mean, I always questioning myself as far as, okay, why did that line change? And here is one of the charts that I came up with to explain not only in the past couple years why our cost went up, but also to explain why in the most recent year of data, why it went down. And what you see in this chart is from the previous chart, you see the all participant line, you see the peer average line for total, but then you see a stacked column there for DRS's response to the survey in each of the years going back to 2014. And how I've color-coded the column is you see kind of other base costs, you see our information technology base costs, and then you see on top of that, how much our major project costs, kind of our one-time major projects, how those cause basically the total height of the column to change year to year, and how they really do explain why our line kind of goes up and down. And what this really gets at is, when we have a major project, it does have a material impact upon our total cost. And the good thing about that is we are able to see, okay, we're not changing something in the underlying business to drive our costs up. It really is these one-time implementation costs. The other thing that I have differentiated in this chart, is I did kind of isolate out what the IT cost is for the base operations. And I did that really to make one point, and that's that CEM in their analysis, when they do their best practice analysis and they do some of their industry studies, they've consistently identified that IT is a big cost in public pension administration. And from my perspective, it has to be. We couldn't do our job without our systems. You think of having data on potentially just under 1 million members between active members, annuitants, and inactive members. That's a lot of data, a lot of transactions. We have to get them right. You couldn't do that with ledger paper. Well, you could, but it would take a lot of retirement specialists to be able to do that. Yeah, so it is a big cost, and it's a very important cost in pension administration. Now, one of the other items that comes out in the data, CEM, in looking back at total costs and in trying to explain, why administrators have different total costs. They were approached, it's like, okay, well, it's not complexity. Maybe it's IT, is it the building we're in? Is it service? Going through all these individual items to try to get at, what is that magic bullet? Well, CEM looked at it and said, well, okay, let's see, is it one of the 30 activities? Do one of those always explain why someone's either high cost or low cost? And what CEM identified was, statistically, no. If you're overall high cost, you tend to be high cost in nearly all 30 of the activities. If you're overall low cost, you tend to be overall or low cost in all the 30 activities. I took a look at that and looked at, okay, which quartile, if you will, are each of our 30 cost components. Where's our data point? Where is it closest to? You saw that our total column is really right around that first quartile of cost, kind of we're basically in the lowest 25% for total cost. Well, then I should expect, based upon CEM's argument, that all my individual 30 data points should be pretty much close to that. Well, this really comes out in the data. We hover right around that first quartile, that 25% cutoff line. We're either closest to it or just above it. And there was only kind of one anomaly data point where we were actually closest to the third quartile. But when you get down that far into the data, you get into more subjective interpretations as far as, okay, I know my total costs. Now, which one of the 30 buckets do I put it in? And that's where even the CEO at CEM identified, okay, let me caution you, when you get that far down into the data, some of your comparisons aren't going to be as strong as when you're working with your totals. So it was good to see that kind of their analysis, did pan out when I got into this level. Now, in addition to getting the report, one of the things that, CEM will also coordinate best practice, do analytical white papers, if you will, research studies. They have gotten more into that realm with kind of a change in the chief executive and some of their operating practices. And one of the things they did at the most recent conference, they talked about, global trends. And this was actually from one of their presentations at the conference. And I'm sitting there and saying, wow, did they just talk with us? Because I could see DRS in each of the bullet points. The first one, IT playing an increasingly greater role in pension administration. This one really plays into the second one, which is digital first. The push kind of initially a lot by the Dutch, they refer to it as the low-cost channel. How can they get people to basically do self-service and to really work a lot at designing very intuitive, very easy-to-use self-service applications, and then how to train their retirement specialists, if you will, to help people help themselves. That's how they worked from their perspective on, pushing digital first. But more and more of our peers working on digital first. But then what you get into is you get into the third bullet, cybersecurity. If you make it too easy, other people can get in there and make it easy for themselves. So the work that we have to put in on cybersecurity to make sure that our systems aren't just easy to use, but they're very secure when they're being used. And then the final bullet there that impacted all of us, the post-pandemic workforce. Having the hybrid workforce, a lot of your workforce working remotely, how do you provide the same level of customer service? How do you work on your own corporate, just that feel of being in the office? Building teams, managing people, training people, onboarding people. How do you kind of stand up and talk to the person on the other side of the cubicle to get assistance when that doesn't exist? How do you get that? So there is a challenge there within our peer group. So that was kind of the closing observation from participating in pension administration benchmarking. Does anyone have any questions?
Questions? On the one-on-one counseling, when they brought it back in place, I know you just kind of talked about changing the work environment. Did they do virtual counseling at all, or is that now an option?
Yes, we do have Zoom counseling where you can sign up, get an appointment, so it's a dedicated time slot, and the retirement specialist will go out, log in, be there to receive the Zoom counseling.
Is that popular?
I believe so. There is someone in the audience who could respond to that.
I'm getting a nod, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good. Other questions? All right. Thank you.
I can sit up here for the whole 45 if you want to. Yeah.
Appreciate you sharing with us.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
All right. Number 6. Oh, we're getting into Jacob. Go ahead, Steve.
This is an item that was identified by the board for your interim work plan earlier this year. It spins out of legislation that was proposed last session. The legislation wasn't recommended by the board or anything, but there was legislation regarding part-time LEF members. LEF is currently requires members to be full-time, fully compensated, and so the board was asked to look into this particular topic, this interim, and with that, I will turn it over to Jacob.
There we go. Got the mic. Good morning still. Jacob White, staff to the board. The issue in front of the board here is, there it is, law enforcement agencies adopting flexible work policies may be able to help address some hiring and retention issues. However, part-time law enforcement officers are not always eligible for membership in LEF 2. Under current law, LEF 2 requires law enforcement officers to be full-time and commissioned. Part-time positions would typically be PERS positions instead of LEF positions. However, in that definition of full-time there, you can see that the terminology normally expected to earn basic salary makes it so that it's possible that LEF members can, for a limited amount of time, be part-time as long as their position continues to be normally expected to be full-time. Not a common occurrence, but the law does allow for partial service credit under that. And then also another thing that comes in play with, that will come back up here with the legislation that was proposed, is that there also can be part-time law enforcement officers that can retain their commission, but my understanding is that that can only be for a year, and after a year, if they're not full-time, then they lose that commission. So this issue, as Steve said, came from a bill that was proposed last session. The bill was not all about part-time pension issues. That was just pretty much kind of one or two bullet points on a large bill. I'm not going to read through all of these bullet points for you, but the kind of big picture of it is, so on this slide I've got in the bill it laid out what flexible work policies may do. And most of this was around allowing officers to work less than full-time as part of an alternative work schedule. And then the bill also laid out what flexible work policies may not do. This was a lot of concerns from labor organizations that having flexible work policies could not cause a reduction in full-time officers. It could not alter existing collective bargaining agreements, and that it must include the part-time and full-time officers in the same collective bargaining agreement. But the bill did, like I said, also have some impacts to LEF 2. It changed the definition of general or limited authority peace officer to remove the requirement that an officer be employed full-time. And then it also allowed for part-time law enforcement officers in LEF 2. So like I said, technically they are allowed under the current law, but this would allow a full permanently part-time position to be be eligible for Left 2. So the legislative history of this bill, both bills were amended in their policy committees. They received different amendments. As you can see there, the House bill had a larger amendment, and then the Senate one, not so much. But there were no changes to the Left 2 portion of it, so not going to walk you through all of those changes since they didn't impact Left 2. And then there was also an actuarial fiscal note. It was indeterminate cost due to lack of data. The actuary's office did get into some behavioral assumptions and some possible changes to plan demographics. They laid out what data they did not have. They believed it would likely increase the number of officers in the retirement system. Just to go back to a previous bullet point on another slide, that the flexible work policies could not reduce the number, so that made it so the assumption was it would have to increase the number of officers. And then OSA did not know the current number of officers who would be eligible to join Left 2 because of this, didn't know what the level of interest would be from employers and members, and then they also did not know the demographics of those who would choose to do this. The testimony on the bill was kind of interesting, just not a topic, not that I've been here for all that long comparatively, but the topic of trying to encourage women to join law enforcement and to give them the opportunity to work part-time, especially while they have young children, was discussed in those meetings. So that could come into play potentially with any changes to demographics. So short and sweet presentation here. The next steps for the board would be to either motion for a comprehensive report or to take no further action at this time. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacob. So before the group, we have kind of choices, number 1 or number 2.
Make a motion for number 2, Mr. Chair.
All right, there's been a motion made and seconded for number 2, which is no further action at this time. Discussion? Hearing or seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? All right, number 2 is adopted. Thanks, Jacob.
Hey, Tim. So how am I getting to the non-duty to,
Mr. Chair, item number 7 on the agenda was also put on the board's interim work plan earlier this year. It arises out of a situation where the statutory eligibility for what's considered duty and non-duty changes over time. And so you may have a member who, at the time he retired, his condition was considered non-duty, but now it could be considered duty. And the question then was, the topic has to do with what to do in those type of situations or what could be done. With that, I will turn it over to Jacob.
Okay. For the record again, Jacob White, staff to the board. So Steve laid out the issue real well here, but just to restate it, the criteria for duty disabilities has changed over time, and as a result, there may be members who were approved for a non-duty disability with conditions that would qualify as duty-related if that injury occurred today or after the law was changed. And really, we're aware of one condition, and I'll get into more detail about that, but it's PTSD and the way PTSD is handled. So I've got a hypothetical situation here to show the issue, but first, so prior to 2008, a Left 2 member who made a claim of PTSD from multiple exposures could not qualify for duty disability. it had to be from a single event that they were diagnosed as suffering from PTSD, and then that single event had to be duty related. So if we have a situation where it's prior to 2018, member makes a claim, medical evidence shows it's from multiple exposures, DRS agreed that the member has a disabling condition of PTSD, but it's preventing them from continuing to work as preventing them to work as a firefighter. However, the injury was not caused by that single event. And so they approved them for non-duty disability. So the question in front of the board today is, should the law be changed to allow for members who retired prior to 2018 and who were approved for non-duty disability to be eligible for duty disability in scenarios like the one in the bullet above? So some legislative history on this issue. Just have the creation of the duty disability, the creation of the catastrophic disability, and then years later, the changes made to the PTSD law. And so there were multiple changes made at that time under that PTSD law of making it a presumptive disease and laying out criteria for what for new hires of how they had to qualify for it to be considered a presumptive disease. But the other thing that bill did was to change it from that sole event to multiple exposures. And then last session there was the DRS Ombuds bill, which attempted to address this issue. But that bill did not pass. Okay. So just a little bit of background. I know there's some people on the board who are very knowledgeable in this area, but on presumptive occupational diseases. So just big picture wise, a condition being identified as a presumptive disease shifts the burden of proof from the member to L&I to prove, to determine whether the person actually suffers from it or not. So it makes it a lot easier for a member to qualify. And then, so something being made a presumptive disease is a different issue than a condition not qualifying as duty related. So that's, I think there's been some confusion as we've discussed this as far as things being added to that list of presumptive diseases, which occurs on a fairly regular basis. That just shifts the burden. It doesn't often take a disease that was considered not possible to be duty related, could only be non-duty, to being duty. It just shifts that burden to the member. So here we're really focused on those ones, a condition that would not qualify. Although obviously the board could open that up to consider presumptive diseases as well. So I had a chance to start working with DRS on trying to identify the possible number of people who could qualify if there was a change to the law like this. DRS identified that there were 56 Left 2 members who qualified for non-duty disability after the effective date of the PTSD law. Obviously, that doesn't mean that all of them had made claims of PTSD. In fact, there's one case that we're aware of, that the board's been aware of for years, that we believe would likely fall under this category. And then DRS was able to identify 3 or 4 others that would need to be reviewed further. So if this proposal did move forward, I'd work with DRS to get copies of those and start to go through those documents and see if we think they would meet this criteria or not. Okay, so next steps again. Number 1, I think I kept flipping these to confuse you guys of changing where no action and where comprehensive briefing is. But number 1, motion to receive comprehensive briefing, and 2, no action today. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Are there any questions first? Go ahead, Senator.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Just curious, is this something potentially that DRS could accomplish by a formal rulemaking process or a policy issue?
I'd say we've spoke with DRS about that, and they've come back after talking to their legal counsel and told us no, that it would take a change in legislation.
other questions? Mark?
No, I'll make a motion for number 1.
Okay. Discussion on the motion. We have a motion made and seconded. Discussion.
I mean, just on the face of it, the statute isn't, from my perspective, it's not reasonable to limit it to a single occurrence when other occurrences are obviously cumulative and they have the same effect on the individual. And I suspect that their treating physicians would agree with that. So I don't think it's reasonable the way that it stands now, and I think there should be more consideration for what the healthcare provider, what the psychiatrist or the psychologist says.
Okay. I hear somebody. Maybe not. Thought I did. Any other discussion, comments? All right, so before us is a motion to adopt or a motion to receive comprehensive briefing. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right. It is adopted. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
Looks like you have another one, Jacob.
Yes, so the next, particularly the next 3 items, wanted to just give a general context. Again, all 3 of these items are before the board today because you asked for them to be in your work plan. This particular item on overpayment responsibility was something the board studied last year as well and moved forward to the work plan for this year. But in a bigger picture, one of the things that I was asked was to share kind of the policy-making context, if you will, the overlay for some of the discussions that the board has. There are a number of different organizations that have some responsibility for setting pension policy in the state. Obviously, the legislature adopts policy and statute. Then there are organizations like the Left 2 Board and the Select Committee on Pension Policy that recommend changes to the legislature. And in some areas, the Left 2 Board can actually set policy, for instance, with respect to the adoption of contribution rates. Then there's also the Department of Retirement Systems can set policy through the adoption of administrative rules. Department of Labor and Industries can do the same. And so you have overlay, and in some of these issues, that overlay can get kind of complicated. Is this a DRS issue? Is this an L&I issue? Is this a Left 2 Board issue? Or is this for the legislature? And the answer could be, well, all of them, depending on how that overlay plays out. With respect to these particular issues, I just wanted to kind of share that because I know that was part of the feedback I've got from several board members in the discussions earlier this year is where do you sit in terms of your policy-making responsibility on some of these issues? And that'll be a question that if there is any question about that from board members, especially on these next several topics, Jacob and I are prepared to discuss that. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. So issue in front of the board here is when employers make an error that causes a retiree to receive an overpayment, the member is typically responsible for paying back that overpayment that they incorrectly received. So the policy question is who should pay for an employer error? In most cases, the legislature has determined that the member is responsible for paying back any overpayments they received. From a policy standpoint, it's the member received money they were not entitled to, and therefore they should be the ones to pay the money back. However, in certain limited circumstances, the legislature has put that responsibility on the employer. The main one is when it's not regarding Left 2 members. It's the PERS 2008, or more than just PERS, but The other systems, the 2008 IRFs, early retirement factors that have very strict return to work restrictions. And so the legislature in those cases decided to put that onus on the employer in most circumstances. It gets further complicated from there. I won't get into all of it since it doesn't impact LEF. And then for contributions that are not made timely, the employer is responsible for paying DRS, the employer, and the member contributions. However, then using employer pickup, which I'll get into, a little tease for a future for a presentation coming up. We'll talk more about employer pickup, just exciting things to come. That employer can then collect the member contributions from the member, but it's up to them to do that, not DRS. And then in even more limited circumstances, DRS can choose to charge the employer for lost investment earnings. Typically, those would be subsidized by the plan, and there's only one case that I'm aware of where DRS attempted to do that, and the courts let them charge some of it, and that was King County versus Dolan, which was regarding public defenders, not left two members. And in that case, DRS decided to charge King County because it was such a large amount of money that it would have caused a rate increase for all PERS employers and members due to King County's error. What causes these overpayments? Typically misreported basic salary causes the largest ones. Also, here's another little teaser for what's to come. So what is and is not considered earnable compensation can be very complex. In some cases, it's not, but the ones off that we see overpayments on are can be pretty confusing. And I should add that earnable compensation is different, or basic salary, same thing, is different from plan to plan. So because this is complex, how does DRS work with employers? And I should add there's around 1,400 employers that DRS partners with to report this data and make payments. So first with the RCWs, then the WACs, and then the DRS has an employer support division, and they have employer notices. They have a handbook to help out employers. And then they also provide trainings, and then they have staff that's available to answer emails or talk on the phone with payroll people and other employer representatives and members. I think they also are open to talking to members with some of these questions. I know many of these questions come up during bargaining. Oh, and I should have added on that list too that DRS does have an audit team. And I'm not sure the size of it now, but it's a very small audit team. And like I said, there's 1,400 employers. So they do not make it out to all employers. Yeah. So also there's a statute of limitations on how far back DRS can go to bill members for an overpayment. They can only go back 3 years from the date of discovery. And the rest of the overpayment, as well as any lost investment earnings, would be subsidized by the plan. So how long DRS or the employer takes to discover that there's been an overpayment can have an impact on the size of the overpayment. I should add too, it was interesting talking to DRS about trying to get some data on this, that as part of the, we kind of passed the benefit improvement legislation and then just keep an eye on it, but part of the time that DRS had between the passage of that bill and then the payments being made was not just the programming they had to do of their systems to make those payments and identifying, but in identifying what the payments should be, they had to clean up as much of the left two data as possible. And by clean up, I mean go back and make sure that they have identified what they call recalcs or recalculations of benefits, and that's really regarding ensuring that there were no underpayments or overpayments. So the data for left two at the moment is kind of as caught up in recalcs as it's been in a long time. So here is some of that data. So you can see here there's 3,485 recalcs that resulted in a benefit change to members, and of those, 150 were for overpayments, so around 4% were for overpayments. And then just 27 of those were overpayments that were greater than a 1% change in their benefit. And I should say some of those it was greater than 1%, but that was someone receiving a very small benefit to where it wasn't that, big of a change to result in more than 1%. I was surprised when I first saw this data just on how lopsided it was for underpayments. And so in working with DRS and discussing this, that is often due to, especially in LEF, with overtime is reported a month late. And so if someone retires, there's a 1 month delay in getting the overtime reported. And so that often causes a small underpayment of their first month or two of benefit. Or I guess it could go on longer than that depending on when it gets processed by DRS. So some more data. So 20 months was the average time between someone retiring and a recalc. And so I have this data on here just because of that 3-year statute of limitations, kind of looking at how effective that is, how many fall within that or outside of that. And then this data, like I said, it's a little skewed from normal because of the large cleanup of recalcs that occurred with the benefit improvement project they did. 20 months average time between retirement and recalc. I did want to say there was one number that skewed that a lot, and that was one took 298 months, and it was a very small change. The person's benefit was for a change in $104 of what they were receiving. It went from 472 to 368. So there's an outlier there. And then 76 of the 150 were completed within 1 year, and 130 of the 150 were completed within that 3-year statute of limitations. I just highlight the 1 year there because that's going to come into play with some of the policy options the board could consider. Oh, here we go. Yeah, policy options. So option 1 would be the employer responsibility. So employer pays the overpayment when the overpayment is due to an employer error. If there's any fault of the member in that error, the member would still be responsible. Another option the board could consider would be shortening the statute of limitations from 3 years to 1 year when collecting overpayments. This may also result in encouraging DRS, if possible, to process those recalcs a little quicker. And then another option would be to do some combination of options 1 and 2 to make it the employer responsibility, but to shorten it from 3 years to 1. And then option 4 would be no action. And so the next steps would be no action today, or to motion for a final briefing. And then also for a final briefing, if the board would like to identify one of these policy options, with a final briefing, so I could work with the actuary's office to begin providing some sort of pricing on that option. Thank you. Any questions? Be happy to answer them.
Questions? Go ahead. Jay? Nope.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead, Senator.
That's okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It seems moving forward with legislation on an issue like this is interesting. We'd have to do that. This should be something that appears on its face to be what would be considered an equitable policy to be provided by DRS in this situation. It's not something that's ambiguous at all. That's not the member's fault and the disadvantage it puts them at. Is this something that could have been accomplished by a formal rulemaking process or a policy change by DRS?
I believe this one would take legislation just because the law does put it as the member's responsibility, and then in other instances it's very clear when it's the employer responsibility. But Steve?
Jacob's talked in the past, there are some exceptions where DRS is able to adjust or waive member charges if it's, for instance, a manifest injustice What you've seen, though, is the court cases interpreting manifest injustice have left it so, as a practical matter, that exception is only used when it's actually a DRS error and not an employer or member error that has caused the overpayment. So very rare circumstances has manifest injustice been used to deal with a member overpay.
Yeah, I didn't include that data this time around, but it was, I mean, often they'd go years without using it, and then there'd be kind of a blip of one or two, and then occasionally a larger group that was usually, I think every time there was a larger group, it was had to do with the left to disability retirees and discovering that there had been a calculation error that had been going on for a while.
So for example, if the employer is at fault and causes a problem, the option is not available by policy to charge the employer for their mistake versus the member, is that correct?
That's correct.
Mr. Chair, just to follow up on this, and I know there's going to be more questions, but in order to bring the discussion during the course of a motion, I move for option number 3 as an equitable solution.
I second that.
Okay, motion's been made and seconded to adopt number 3, which is combine options 1 and 2. Employer must pay back overtime payments when the overpayment is due to an employee error, and the statute of limitations for collecting overpayments is shortened from 3 years to 1.
Sorry to interrupt you, but just want to add that I didn't have in there that for a final briefing, so the motion's for a final briefing on that option,
Okay, gotcha.
not adopting the option, yeah.
I gotcha. Thank you. All right. Right. Motion's been, we're in order.
There you go.
All right, so we have a motion and it's been seconded. Discussion. Jay?
I'm going to support the motion. I just have a question that I wanted to get answered. So Jacob, what would be an example of a member error where it would be the member's responsibility to pay back? I'm trying to sort that out in my head. I mean, it's clear to me where an employer makes an error and there's an employer responsibility, but I'm not sure how a member makes an error where they'd be responsible.
Well, are you okay?
Go for it. I
All
don't
right.
think I've had any personal
So-
experience with this.
So a lot of times it's not entirely member error. What you will see is occasionally there'll be situations where an employer and a member will collude, if you will. So there's something that they both agree that they would like to have reported as salary, and it may be questionable, or it may be clearly not salary, but they will together have it reported as salary. With the understanding is, if we get caught, you're paying for it. And that, so in that situation, if you will, the member's hands would not be clean. And if they were caught, the member would end up paying for it.
And I would add too, I did see something in the paper fairly recently about someone committing fraud around reporting overtime to their employer, and that could be another example of, I'm not sure if in that individual case it came back on a pension overpayment or not, but it could.
Just a brief question.
Sure, go ahead. Yes.
So I can wrap my head around it. Hypothetically, if I'm found, or if my employer has misreported my income, DRS finds it, is this something that is taken over time? I mean, it could potentially affect a ripple effect in my income, of course. How do I know that this is happening? Do all of a sudden my retirement's been cut because of this, or what is the process?
Yeah, it's kind of a double whammy on you as far as you would take a reduction in your benefit moving forward, and that would still happen under any of these options. So your benefit would be reduced, and then you would also owe the money that you were overpaid, and then you have some options to how you pay back DRS that money that you owe.
To Darrell's point, is the employee notified when this process is being investigated?
I'm going to look back at DRS here real quick.
I would say generally not until after a decision is made.
Yeah, so just when the decision is actually made and they get notification their benefit's going to be reduced, and they would get the options for how they pay back the overpayment to DRS and the timelines for doing that.
And to follow up, they can go back for 3 years. The impact would impact the employee or the retiree 3 years worth of payments.
Yes.
Sorry.
No,
Can you start
yes,
over?
that's correct.
Just kidding. Sure, go ahead.
Question as far as the process on, I'm looking at it as a fairness issue, because on its surface, it seems like you have an employee who's really has very little, am I feeding back here? Very little control or dominion over the process as far as how their final payment's going to be calculated. It's largely done by the employer and DRS, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And so at that point, from my approximation, the only information that a retiree would receive would be whatever DRS has provided them with when they agree, okay, here's what your monthly payment's going to be when you go through the retirement process. You're saying, hey, DRS, I'm going to retire, so on and so forth. My understanding that's a lump sum. You're not provided like an actual breakdown of the sheet. So that's my question, because I'm trying to understand the fairness perspective, and then also, being that I haven't retired yet, what does that actually look like? What does somebody get that says, is there something that somebody can look at and go, hey, I think there's something wrong here, or yeah, this looks right? Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah, and so no, DRS does not provide like a breakdown when you go to retire of exactly how your final average salary was determined. I mean, I'm sure there could be some members who really watch their paycheck but even then, if you're really keeping a close eye on your paycheck, you're still with how complex what is basic salary and what is not basic salary. I don't think there's reasonable to expect a member to be able to go through that for their final 5 years of final average salary to determine whether it was all reported correctly.
So essentially, a member would not have access or provided the numbers to even know whether there was an issue or not when they retire, other than getting the dreaded phone call or email, hey, sorry, you were overpaid and now you have to pay it back.
Yeah, they would just know what their final average salary was for the calculation the DRS did.
As Jacob mentioned earlier, typically before a person retires, these questions almost always come up in the context of bargaining. They'll be bargaining over a particular provision like ad pay. Is this going to be considered salary or not? And the employer can look at the DRS, the employer handbook, they can look at the employer notices, they can contact employer services if they have questions. Sometimes it gets extraordinarily complex, and you'll see a couple of examples of that coming up in terms of what is and isn't salary. And then if the employer has gone through the process of working with DRS, they've got an answer from DRS, yes or no. Sometimes that can be challenged, but for the most part, they've got that. What'll happen is somebody will make an assumption. Oh, we changed the bargaining agreement, but this has been reported for 15 years. We didn't realize now that it's not going to be reported, and we didn't ask, and it gets caught in an employer audit. That's where the overpayments tend to come up. So the questions almost always come from bargaining prior to retirement. The problems, the overpayments, almost always result from somebody didn't ask a question during bargaining, and then it ends up getting caught years later as part of an employer audit, usually as an audit. There's a few other situations where somebody will ask a question. Maybe a payroll person will ask a question saying, hey, we've been doing this. I just got some training. I'm not sure that it's right. And they'll find out, nope, it's not. And then DRS will go back and say, oh, who's retired from this employer in the last 3 years? We need to review their accounts and act accordingly.
Yeah, and that is a good point too, that there is no requirement for for employers to send like new collective bargaining language to DRS, but they can do that. And I would assume if they do that and get the wrong advice from DRS, that DRS may choose to use that manifest injustice to waive the overpayment.
One more question. What generates the audit from, what triggers DRS to come in and check my retirement to see if I've been overpaid?
I think
So they do an individual audit in almost every case where they'll compare they'll go back and look for these small salary underreportings. So as Jacob was talking with the data about, how many 3,000 some audits that had been done, almost all of those were just matter of course, that they go back and they check your account after you've retired to see if additional compensation has been reported, and then they do what they call a post-audit, a recalc to adjust your benefit. The employer audit situations come up in usually one of three. DRS randomly selects employers for audits. As Jacob mentioned, there's 14,000 employers. There's like
1,400.
600 LEP employers, last I heard, in the state. So random audits don't happen often, and unfortunately, they tend to happen to employers who are geographically located closer to Olympia. You're more likely to get a random audit, for instance, if you're in Thurston County or Olympia or something like that. Just for that reason, they use those for training. And then there will be media. The second thing is something will come up in the media that looks wrong, and in the course of communicating with the employer, DRS will determine, yeah, there might be a much bigger issue here, and an employer audit is warranted. And then similar to that, but less public, is you'll get either a whistleblower or an internal whistleblower, might be too strong a word, but you'll have questions about how something has been administered or decisions that have been made, and those will be brought to DRS's attention outside of the media, and DRS will look at that and say, that warrants enough for an audit. So that might be, for instance, like some of those collusion examples that I mentioned earlier. Sometimes they end up in the paper and sometimes they don't. But if DRS becomes aware of them, they will fix them.
Madam Chair, one follow-up. You kind of begged the question, Steve, that if we have an over-contribution on that has to be recovered, isn't it just as likely we have under-contributions, and is there an auditing process to find those errors also?
Other than the regular check-in that goes, which catches all of those small under-reporting, no. There's nothing that treats under-reporting differently than over-reporting, so those could end up as an employer audit. So say, for instance, there is a very common thing. Are my deferred compensation, the contributions that I make for deferred comp, are they salary or not? There's the answer is sometimes yes, sometimes no. If they are not being reported, and you think they should be as a member or as a stakeholder, and you contact DRS and they're like, yeah, looks like they should be, they will go back and they will adjust those benefits retroactively, and they'll bump them up. And there's not the same kind of limits on collection. So if the member has been underpaid, those get fixed. There's some limits on fixing the overpays.
Other questions? On the motion to adopt number 3, to move forward for a full comprehensive report. Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? It's adopted. All right, thank you, Jacob.
Thank you.
We are at noon, and I know I have a note here that lunch has been delivered, so what's your thoughts on how much time? Lunch, quick break.
Would you like to take a quick break, get lunch, and then come back and work through it?
Yes.
Yeah. So
15 minutes?
Yeah.
Perfect, okay. We'll be recessed for 15 minutes. All right, well, we'll go ahead and reconvene our meeting, and we are on item number 9, which is the holiday payments. It's the initial report, and Jacob's back up in the hot seat. Sorry to take you away from your food, Jacob.
Okay. One second. There we go. Okay, issue in front of the board, this presentation is the current administrative interpretation of when holiday pay is considered earnable compensation or basic salary has created a situation where members may be treated differently based on their employer's payroll system, not on the actual days they worked. So you've kind of got a warning, but these next two presentations are going to be a little dense and complicated. Okay, so legislative history on this one. Once again, this was an issue that came out of the DRS Ombuds bill that did not pass last session. Okay. First, just wanted to explain holiday leave banks. So left members, as you can imagine, are often required to work on recognized holidays due to the nature of their jobs. If a left member works on a holiday or takes the day off using a personal or floating holiday, that is considered basic salary. Many left employers, though, have created holiday leave banks. And if an employee works the holiday, it is considered a regular work day. And instead, they have the holiday payout goes into a bank, and later the employee can cash out that holiday leave bank. And so the underlying issue here is whether that should be considered basic salary or not when they cash out the holiday leave. So big chart here that's hard to read of the basic salary table. Just want to point out two items on this table. So this is taken from DRS's rule, WAC. Overtime is considered basic salary, and cash outs are not basic salary. And one of the policy reasons behind cash outs not being considered basic salary is the potential for pension spiking. And then it's just a reminder, left to benefit is determined by service credit years and your final average salary. Final average salary is determined by what is considered basic salary or not. So is a holiday pay bank cash out basic salary? It really comes down to what type of holiday is in that bank. If it's whether it's a recognized holiday or a personal floating holiday. So cash outs for recognized holidays are considered overtime, and overtime is basic salary for left two. I get where this can be kind of confusing because I just said that cash outs are not basic salary, but in this circumstance, that portion of the cash out is considered basic salary because there is an assumption by DRS that you worked that holiday. So cash outs of personal floating holidays are considered a leave cash out and therefore not considered basic salary for left two. So to guide employers in how to report this to DRS, DRS has what they call, I mentioned this in a previous presentation, but they have employer notices. DRS tends to use those when they believe it is something more procedural and not a policy decision that might be more appropriate in to go through rulemaking. But when they're just offering a procedural option or procedural direction to employers, they will often use employer notices. So if employees are allowed, under the employer notice, if employees are allowed to cash out hours from a holiday leave bank, employers are instructed to not include non-recognized holidays in the holiday leave bank. So to not include the floating personal holidays, to only include the ones that are for recognized holidays in the leave bank. They're instructed not to combine these, but not all employers have the same payroll system. Like I said, there's around 1,400 employers, varying levels of sophistication of payroll systems, as you can imagine. And so DRS has, through the employer notice, tried to acknowledge this and provide a way for employers to still be able to report this without forcing them to try to track this by hand, since they are to buy a payroll system for this sole purpose. And so the first option is, if their payroll system can track it, the different types of holiday pay, then just report the ones that are for specific holidays as earnable compensation, and then don't report the floating personal holidays as earnable compensation. If the employer's payroll system does not go down to that granular level of detail, they should use what they call the first in, first out method. And so this would mean that they first report all of the hours that were in the holiday bank that could have been the reportable holidays, the specific holiday dates. So if they have 80 hours of real holidays and another 10 hours of personal holidays, the first 80 hours that the employee takes out of their leave bank should be reported to DRS as earnable comp, and then anything after that time would not be reported as earnable comp. And so the goal here is to, as much as possible, have the end result be the same for the member, that they have the same maximum amount of holiday pay cash out that can be considered earnable compensation. Yeah, so I guess I should say at this point that the concern that we're hearing was that some members were getting all of their holiday leave reported, whether it was for the specific holidays or the floating holidays, that it was just all being reported as basic salary for some people, and then for others it was not. So this was one in working with DRS and diving into this, what they've advised employers, that should not be occurring. And I'm not aware of any specific examples where we've got where that is the case, where everything was being reported by an employer. Yeah, and then, so I guess to kind of on that, so I said at the beginning, the issue is this concern that people are being treated based on their employer's payroll system, and so there is some truth to that, as I just laid out. And so I think if if this moved forward to a comprehensive briefing, it would probably be to look at issues like, should everyone do first in, first out? Should there be a change in, requiring all employers to track it down to that specificity? Butchered that word. And then, or changing what is defined as basic salary or not basic salary. Should all of the holiday pay be basic salary, or should there continue to be this split? So with that, next steps in front of the board today are no action at this time, or a motion for comprehensive briefing. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Go ahead, Jay.
So I'm struggling with this one just a little bit, and I get that it's complicated, but when I think of all my employees have floating holidays, right, bargaining unit or not, and most years we offer two. If we have a wellness incentive, and if we hit it, we offer another floating holiday. But for most people, even though it's titled a floating holiday, it's almost like an extra vacation day, right?
Yes.
And so, I'd have to talk to my payroll team to see what the distinction is they have in the system in terms of how they report. But I'm having trouble linking because we call it a floating holiday, that it's actually holiday pay and not just another leave day.
Yeah, so-
And why would it not be considered just normal compensation?
And so I just verified this with someone from DRS before coming up here to make sure I understood it correctly. And so what the confusion is when it's in the bank. So if you just use that floating holiday, then it's reported as basic salary. It's when you put it in the bank and then use it that it's an issue. That it's not basic salary.
Okay, so those that would have banks are probably going to be union employees that have negotiated some sort of bank, my guess, over independents. Independents wouldn't do that. So I guess my struggle here, my question is you got a lot of different organizations that have labor contracts that have negotiated something very specific about how the members in those unions choose to take compensation for hours in a leave bank. And so my nervousness here is, how does DRS, and how do we set a policy or recommend a policy that could potentially override labor contracts and what that looks like? So and those of you on that side of the table, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but that's just a question I have.
Could you put up that basic salary table, that chart you had that dealt with WACs? I can't read it on here. That helps me. I just want to look at that for a little bit.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, in response to Jay's statement, yeah, I believe that would be correct. The CBA world is very different than the rest of the world, right? Because you can kind of violate all kinds of weird, FSLA laws and stuff like that through the arbitration. And so for us, and this may not be a question you can answer, but for the sake of conversation, if I work a holiday, so if I don't work a holiday, then I just don't get paid that day unless I want to take it as a day off, which I have to use some type of leave. So let's just say it'd be PDO. And that PDO would be part of my regular salary. Now, if I worked that holiday, I would get the holiday pay, and it would be part of my regular salary. If I worked that holiday and I banked that time as comp time, so I'm going to bank it at whatever your comp time rate is, and that goes into essentially my leave day. So it really does, like you said, it's just like another leave day. But it's still part of your regular salary, being that it's in that bank. Just like if I worked a regular overtime day that was not a holiday, it goes into my comp time bank. If I choose to bank it as comp time, it's still a regular holiday. So my question to you, Jacob, is if I work a holiday and that holiday I bank as comp time, is that considered what you're referring to as a bank?
Yeah, so you're seeing the complexity. And the answer is, it depends on the employer. That gets back to Jacob's earlier point about the payroll system. So you will see employers, for instance, they have the exact same policy about requesting exchange time off that they have requesting annual leave time off or requesting your personal holiday off. And the distinction between those hours is not 100% clear in their payroll system, whereas the treatment of it is like, well, if it's exchange time, you get to cash out that time and a half, just like if you would have gotten paid double time and a half for overtime. If it's holiday, you usually can carry over some amount. As state employees, we are allowed to carry over some from year to year up to a max of $240. If it's a personal holiday, state employee, use it or lose it. So the treatment of them is different, and the salary treatment of them is also different. But depending on the employer's payroll system, it may not be very easy for DRS to distinguish. You have 300 hours in your bank. How much of that is exchange time? How much of that is vacation time? And how much of that is your personal or floating holiday? And what do we do in those situations, or what do we tell employers to do in those situations? That's kind of, you've kind of taken it a step further, but that is the complexity that's in this issue. And then you have members saying, you know, oh, when I worked here, that was part of my salary, and now I work here and it's not. Why? And
Yes, sir.
so,
Go ahead, Senator.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. We've asked a couple of questions on this topic that have to do with individual practical applications, you know, in situations. And I swear, as you go down each one of these rabbit holes, everything's different on this. I'm not even going to ask you the question here, Jacob. I'm going to go to Steve for this because it'll probably end up with him anyway. But back up at 100,000 feet, if issues are not matters of public policy, a collective bargaining agreement can subordinate a lot of the protections out there that exist in WAC and statute on that. We've had, in a general sense, enacting legislation like this, if it was crafted correctly, would it be able to set a threshold out there or a common standard to resolve some of the inconsistencies between the several agencies, the several CBAs, and the ambiguity and definitions out there between employers, sometimes, you know, with like situations? Does it hold the potential to streamline all this and solve that issue?
that's a fair question. And to be honest with you, this particular question, the next question, these were ones that came to us as left staff, a little over a year ago. And they were issues that we meet with the Department of Retirement Systems monthly to coordinate. And so if we get something that, man, how do you deal with this? We'll ask them. This topic and the next one were two that the ask was, can you put this into rulemaking? You've got the table up there and it says holiday pay is in and leave cash outs are out. So if you've got this kind of animal that maybe has 1 foot in one box and 1 foot in another box, maybe clarifying that in rule as opposed to clarifying that in an employer notice would be more appropriate. That gets back to that earlier Venn diagram kind of discussion I was having about the different levels of policy. I don't know, you'd have to ask DRS. At the time we were told that it's not going into rulemaking, and I don't know if since session, this, again, Jacob mentioned this was one of the things that popped up in the ombudsman bill, whether DRS has revisited that decision to keep this in an employer notice as opposed to a rule. I think, Jacob, you've got a copy of the employer notice in your report on this topic.
Yeah.
You can see it's challenging. It can be challenging for a payroll person to sort that out. They can contact DRS and share here, and that's frequently what will happen. Here's our bargaining agreement. You tell me, is this in or out? And they'll get an answer. It's kind of that piece about, does the answer make sense to the member, or one way or another, whether it's in or out? That's the piece where where we get contacted then.
Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to try to do this math in my head here. So is the issue really most agencies, most cities have 11 paid holidays, therefore there's the 88 hours that Jacob has there. When it comes to the floating holidays, we are use them or lose them, right? So they're not, you can't cash them out. You either got to use them during that year or they go away. So the issue is if you, I'm trying to figure out how to get there with this one, because if you lose them, then there's no value. But if somehow they go into a bank because you took those and those hours go into your bank, that's the issue we're talking about, is trying to cash those out, and whether those are part of the basic salary structure.
Kind of. Usually these banks, they're good for a year.
Right.
So with each year, you're cashing them out, or you're using them. If the personal holiday is in there, it'd be like me as a state employee, I didn't take my personal holiday, but I got it included in a cash out at the end of the year. We don't have anything like similar as state employees, but that's out there. It's been bargained in a number of jurisdictions. The granularity to track each of these different leave types varies from employer to employer.
So my brain says the 88 hours makes sense and not to treat the floating holiday as some additional holiday payout because you assume people are going to take the days. But the only concern that I raised it earlier, is what individual CBAs might say around this and what might have been or might be negotiated about how different employers treat those floating holidays with their bargaining groups and what agreements they might have. And so I raised that as just a concern I have, and maybe it's not a big concern, but anyway.
As an example, the contract that we had before I retired was day for day. So you're talking 88 hours. We worked 12-hour shifts. And so if we banked a holiday, it was 12 hours. And then to throw another wrench into it, you had a Kelly day that you threw into that bank. And if you rolled those into comp, and you could burn them or carry them or sell them back. So the issue comes in on the day before the holiday. Do you want pay or do you want bank time? And you got to choose that. But 88 hours was nothing when you're working a 12-hour shift because it's day for day, and that was part of the bargaining.
And I will add that I'm not certain, but I don't believe that all employers have the same holidays, that they've got the same, and maybe they all max out at 88, but I don't think so. Yeah.
Jacob, a couple questions for you. I understand you have an employer notice. Is an employer notice binding?
No, so it can be changed at any time. They can rescind that, make changes to it, which is why typically they try to keep it to procedural, not policy options, but.
So if an individual or an employer decides to do exactly what you're doing, or what we're talking about, they're providing some benefit, could DRS then just change that? And then what would happen to the money that was already, the benefit was already given to the employee? I mean, can they change a rule and go back and get it? Kind of a take back, a claw back? Or is it then proactive or, future?
Yeah, or Steve's going to jump in on this one.
Yeah, some of these questions are probably best for DRS, but in general, what happens is if DRS determines that an employer has reported an error, then they fix the error, just like we talked about the last time. So if they were allowing you to cash this time out, and then DRS reviews the agreement and says, that time seems to include an extra 8 hours that you shouldn't have been allowed to cash out, or an extra 12 hours, or an extra 16 hours if you got 2 days, you need to back that out of their salary, and then if they've retired or not, that might be, a correction of error type of situation. But yeah, so this, the employer notice is just there to help employers report correctly. If they don't report correctly, then it becomes a correction of error situation.
Okay, so that's my question. Next is the individual versus the employer. If an individual feels that their time should have been, added, or their bank should have been included, what's their recourse to move forward?
Or a CBA.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they would need to go to DRS and ask for an administrative decision on whether that should have been included or not. And then they would go through the APA process of petition, appeal, court.
I guess I'll ask Sean. Maybe Sean, I'll put you on the hot seat. Are there people right now that are receiving a benefit for holiday time? Sorry. Way to put him on the spot. So the rule is don't sit next to Sean.
I was warned that I needed to be here. So I think there are a couple of different questions going on here. Jacob mentioned that holiday pay we consider it overtime. If somebody cashes out a holiday, one of the state-recognized holidays, and so that's where to the question of how many holidays does a person get. If it's one of the state-recognized holidays, and they cash it out, we consider that overtime. In the same way we would consider comp time overtime. The clarification I wanted to make specifically around the comp time question was, DRS says that you have to report that back to when it was actually worked. So you can't carry comp time for 10 years and move it into your FAS. And that's similar to what Steve was saying about this. We're talking about 1 year at a time with holidays. We're looking at the calendar year holidays and are they includable. So almost everyone, I assume, in LEF has some sort of holiday bank cash out as part of their CBA and likely is being included in their FAS appropriately because they had overtime that was cashed out because they worked on a specific holiday. The floating holidays, I think, is where it gets complicated because if they end up all in the same bank, in the same way with the comp time, if the employer doesn't have a way to distinguish that from regular vacation time, it all ends up in the same bank and then they're cashing it out. Well, vacation leave is not reportable under RCW. It's statute. It's not a DRS decision. That's the way the plan was designed to not include cash outs of leave. We're not considering a holiday bank a cash out of leave. We're considering it overtime worked. And it's just it's a different version of comp time in our mind.
So just give you an example. A department provides, let's say 100 hours. Because fire department's different hours away that, might provide the benefit. And they provide 100 hours. It's not personal time. It's not flex time. It's 100 holiday hours that they're going to give a person. They get those on January 1st. And they have a choice. They make a selection. And they can either take some of those days off or some of those hours off, or they can leave them in a bank and they will be compensated at the end of the year for not using those hours. If they choose to take all of the 100 hours and put them in a cash out bank, are those 100 hours then compensable for retirement?
Yes, I would probably want to confer with other colleagues at DRS around the 100 hours specifically, because we're tying them directly to state recognized holidays. And I understand you all have different shifts, and some places a day might be considered 12 hours, some places a day might be considered 8 hours. And so I'm not certain how our employer compliance team looks at those specific situations, or if it is really just 88 hours, and maybe it's 96 now. There have been additional state recognized holidays that have happened since we've last talked about this. So I think that's an open question. But to the basic point of your question, if there is a holiday bank, it's all associated with state recognized holidays. If they cash that out at the end of the year, it's all includable. It also gets, some of these questions that I'm sure come to Jacob and Steve are around what happens if I quit in the middle of the year. I'm trying to cash out my entire bank. Well, those holidays haven't happened in November, December. That's not appropriately considered overtime worked during that time as a holiday. So it should be prorate. An employer's payroll system should be able to prorate that with the holidays that have taken place.
Good, thank you. Okay, Kevin?
Thanks.
Okay, so next steps in front of the board are either no action at this time or a motion for a comprehensive briefing.
I guess I got a question.
Oh,
And
good question.
I don't know if this was already addressed, but is this something that can be resolved by addressing through a WAC, or can DRS make this change internally, or is this going to take legislative action?
Sorry, Steve.
Well, we asked DRS to do it by rulemaking staff-wise because we felt like it could be done by rulemaking. But I don't know if, again, you'd have to ask them if they intend to do rulemaking. The last we heard was no, but that was back in, January.
Yes, so that's my question. Thank you, Steve.
Is that a Seth question or is that a Sean question?
I think I've certainly spoken with the director about this, and we're comfortable making a rule that matches with what the procedure currently is marked in the employer notice. I think maybe my question back for the board is, what is the problem that's trying to be solved here? I mean, if the employer notice is the documentation and that's the way DRS is currently operating, is the rule changing anything with the operation? And DRS has no problem making this rule. I don't think that is a question here, but I'm not sure what the question is that we're trying to solve.
Well, I think that was what I was trying to understand was what's the difference, which has a higher authority? Is it the rulemaking or is it the notice to the employer? And then how can those be changed and what the process is for input?
Yeah, I certainly understand that question. And DRS is, there have been a number of times over the last few years where we have moved procedure into rule to make it more clear or more obvious, I think, for both our own team members, for employers, for our membership as well. And so the rulemaking process has, more formal notification. People have the opportunity to make comment. And so there's certainly, I could see some advantage for that if the board were interested in that.
Yeah, I think from a board that has stakeholders from all different areas, I think that would be, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that would be the desired outcome, to have input and have the ability for our employers to ask the questions like Jay said, or we talk about collective bargaining, or our elected officials maybe even to dive deeper into how it affects maybe something else. So I think that would be the direction that I would suggest. It just seems to make sense.
So how about those employers who they would have to do manual calculations in if they don't have the appropriate software to differentiate between those two circumstances? That's what I heard in the presentation, is that there's a bunch of employers out there who don't have the capability to do that with their current technology. I don't really care, one way or the other, do it by hand or go by another vendor, but I don't know how practical that is. I don't know how many of them don't have the software, if they're able to do it by hand and put it in like I have at home, like a file, with like a paper file.
So I think my understanding is we're not asking DRS to put into rule getting rid of the first in, first out method that they allow for those employers, but instead just putting that in rules so that there's some permanence that, members can and employers can count on what's considered basic salary and what isn't, with the, just how there could be confusion between what holiday leave is basic salary when it's cashed out and what holiday leave is not.
Like Seth mentioned too, even just the hours. Are we looking at a state cap of 88, or is it a collective bargaining arrangement that allows for 120? Whatever that is.
So
Go ahead.
would that rule, would the recommendation be that rule follow that, whatever the collective bargaining is for those, like I say, a day for day is different as to the number of hours. So maybe that rule, because if there's a steadfast rule, that would give, from a bargaining unit, that would give that unit a better idea and direction of where they can go through their negotiations for an agreement there with the.
I think that would be the hope, is that through the process of having these open meetings where we could have testimony and people can have these conversations, I think that would be helpful. I'm probably sure we'd probably throw a few other wrinkles out into it. We're pretty good at thinking of stuff.
Okay.
So for our process, I think, Seth, I think you're going to take that back, hopefully, to your team. For us, I think we probably need to keep this on our burner, right? And keep it out there for us to keep looking at. What's our feeling? We've got two options you put before us: the comprehensive briefing or the no action at this time.
Mr. Chair, is there a third option, thinking outside the box, we table this issue here for further consideration until after legislative session?
That would be an option. Seth, sorry, I'm going to throw you back real quick. how soon, and I appreciate your willingness to kind of work through this, but how soon would we be able to know if this is something that's going to move forward through a rulemaking process?
Yeah, it's a good question, and Jacob can actually probably speak to this more intelligently than I can regarding the rulemaking process. We can certainly file the CR 101 and get it kind of on the schedule, but there is, I think, to maybe the senator's point, that rulemaking process does take time, and it's, you're talking 3 to 6 months before you actually see a final version of it. But we could certainly file a CR 101, within the next few weeks, I would imagine.
I'm just thinking on the fly here, but maybe we could report back on what an administrative update, Steve, on if the CR 101's been filed and how that work is going.
Yeah, I mean, this is, we coordinate with DRS monthly on these issues, and we were talking with them just the day before yesterday about a CR 101 on a different issue. So yeah, this is certainly something that they could let us know, and then we could include in an administrative update in the future, and then depending on how things are progressing or not progressing, you could revisit the issue next year if that, if that's what you were thinking about, the Senator.
Exactly. I was trying to buy 6 months, and after session, everybody to have everything have in front of us off the table, pretty much move forward, have a clean slate. I'll make a motion, I don't know if it takes a motion, to table this until the April 2024 meeting, at which time it'll be revisited, so we're stopping short of the next step at this point and continuing the conversation 6 months from now. I'll bring it back up, at which time we can say no action's needed because they solved the problem, or we can move forward. It allows us flexibility.
I second.
Yeah. All right, so we have a motion to table until our April meeting. Discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, it's tabled. Thanks, Seth. Thanks, Sean.
Yeah, he'll be back soon enough, I think.
Yeah. Seth, move up a row. Trust me. All right. Number 10. Jacob.
Similarly, this was another issue that came up during the past interim. We worked on with DRS, ended up in the ombudsman bill. It's an employer notice, requested rulemaking, and it hadn't happened. Just sort of a procedurally, process-wise, if you're looking at the Venn diagrams, same issue as last time, except a different topic. And with that, I will turn it over to Jacob to explain this extraordinarily complex salary question.
Yeah, you're going to go on a journey with me here on this one of me trying to understand this issue and getting there, and hopefully I'm able to get you there too. Although many of you are so much more experienced with this, working on the bargaining side. But the issue here is that there were concerns raised that DRS was not always treating temporary non-duty and temporary duty disability leave consistently for purposes of basic salary in situations where members utilized leave buyback. Once again, Steve already covered this. It was in the Ombuds bill. So I'm going to start off by talking about temporary duty disability purchase service credit. In front of you are the two types of that service credit. So LEF 2 had, since 1989, had the ability to purchase up to 6 consecutive months of service credit for periods of temporary duty disability, and there was no interest charged for that time period. And then in 2017, there was a law passed that allowed for members of LEF 2 and the other plans to purchase up to 24 consecutive months of service credit for periods of temporary duty disability. However, that 24 months, there was interest charged. So that interest, I just mentioned that because that's going to come back into play here. So then I'm going to move on to authorized leave of absence purchase service credit. So when there's a break in service for a non-duty injury, it would not be covered by temporary duty disability purchase service credit. Instead, it's covered by the more general authorized leave of absence, or ALOA, as it's called by us pension nerds, purchase service credit law. And you can purchase up to 24 months of service credit there. And it's really up to the employer what is considered authorized or not authorized. I will just say, like, it's not just for, it's more general, it's not just for non-duty disability. I think one of the more common areas I've seen it used is for maternity or paternity leave. So just a quick review of those two types of purchase service credit and who pays, so who pays what is important to understanding the confusion around this issue. So for the temporary duty disability, once again, 6 months no interest, 24 months after that with interest. The employer would collect the member contributions using employer pickup. So employer pickup is just the legal provision that the employer is on the hook for collecting the employer or paying the member and the employer contributions, and then it's up to them to determine how to collect that from the member. And then with those service credit options, the state would pay the state contributions as well. For temporary non-duty disability, up to 24 months, and this is a significant difference here, is that the member pays all of the contributions within 5 years of returning to work. So another important part of that is upon returning to work. So it's kind of in the name of it, authorized leave of absence. So that implies it's a leave of absence and you are returning to work. So if a member retires, they're not eligible to purchase service credit with this ALOA option. But with the temporary duty disability, you are able, if at the end of being on temporary duty disability leave, you reach a point where you need to retire, you can do that and still receive this purchase service credit. So clearly there's a legislative policy working here that if the injury occurs at work, that the employer has a responsibility in compensating the member for that time period and with these purchase service credit options. Okay, so like I mentioned in a previous presentation, left to benefit determined by service credit, final average salary. Final average salary is determined by what is and is not considered basic salary. Paid leave is basic salary. Disability payments, workers' comp, private insurance payments, those are not considered basic salary. And then some left members or some left employers have agreements with their members or their employees to require them to buy back the paid leave they have taken while they're out on temporary disability using the insurance payments they receive. So the members have purchased this non-duty disability insurance. They're injured, they're unable to go to work, they receive a check from that insurance company. They have negotiated that they have to hand that check over to their employer in exchange for buying back the leave they took. So that means that the leave they took is then restored to their leave balance, and yeah, they've been paid. And so in trying to understand just why members would agree to this, or why employers would agree to this, my understanding is part of the reason is an incentive for just not being out on disability, that you're not going to receive a disability payment and your basic salary where you're getting paid double for that time period. So I've got a couple examples here just to walk you through of this. I'm going to pick on Steve's brother. I'm making Dave my example. We got Dave falling off a ladder here. That's maybe picking on Dennis a little bit too with that one. But so Dave falls off a ladder and breaks his leg at work. He's out on leave for 12 weeks recovering. I want to walk you just through the procedure of this, so hopefully it help it make sense. So he uses his paid leave while he's out. He also receives a disability insurance or workers' comp payment. His employer, I put allows, but really would require him to buy back the paid leave he took using his disability insurance payment. Since the paid leave was backed out of the system, it's no longer considered basic salary. Instead, he must purchase that service credit. In this instance, he's been injured at work. He qualifies for temporary duty disability, purchase service credit, and then DRS has an employer notice which lays out the procedural options for that member to receive that purchase service credit. So DRS has two procedures. You can kind of tell from how long they are which one's going to be easier. So and method one is where we've kind of run into this concern and this confusion around this. So under method one, the employer reports the regular compensation the employee would have earned if not on temporary duty disability. And the reason they're able to do that is because it's going back to how the temporary duty disability is paid, it's paid using employer pickup. So the employer needs to pay the employer contribution, state needs to pay the state contribution, member needs to pay the member contribution, just like regular pay. So from DRS's perspective, it makes no difference whether they are just reported as they normally would be or they purchase this service credit. On DRS's side, it's the same amount of pay the member's getting that's being reported to them. It's the same amount of service credit they're getting. So they've tried to simplify that for the employer and the member and to make it seamless. So, yeah. And then the other method would be to go through more of a normal process that a member would go through for purchasing service credits. I'm not going to read that whole thing, but it's the normal process of working with DRS, getting a bill, paying the bill, and in doing that process, it also creates a situation where the member could end up having interest making that payment larger. In the first method, because it's seamless, I had mentioned earlier that the first 6 months is interest-free, the next 24 months are charged interest. Under method one, DRS does not charge interest because it's just reported immediately and there's no opportunity for interest to occur. But in method two, it takes more time and there is more opportunity for to have interest. In both methods, the member has their personal leave balance restored and they purchase service credit for their break in service that was created by their personal leave being backed out when they did the buyback provision. So the confusion occurs here because for the member, it can appear as if when the employer uses method one, it can give the appearance that the check they gave their employer counted as basic salary. But that's not actually what's occurring. What's occurring is they are purchasing service credit under the temporary duty disability law. Okay, so once again, employer notice first whack. We've talked a lot about this and the differences there. And this is where I should just go to admit to Steve Norrell. Steve wanted me to do a Venn diagram here, and I was not able to do a Venn diagram that I thought made it easy to understand at all. It just made it more complex. So I'll keep working on that. Someday I will get that Venn diagram in front of you. Okay, so we got Dave again. Injured at home this time, falls off the ladder, breaks his leg at home, out 12 weeks, uses personal leave, receives his disability insurance payment. Once again, the typo here, his employer requires him to buy back the personal leave using his disability insurance payment. Since the personal leave was backed out of the system, he's not actually earning service credit for that time, and it's not reported as basic salary. Instead, he must purchase that service credit. He doesn't qualify for the temporary duty disability purchase service credit. Instead, he's got to use that authorized leave of absence one. And with that one, if you remember, it was all on the member. The employer was not responsible for paying contributions. The state was not responsible. It's up to the member. And so in this instance, DRS does not have an alternative method that would allow the member to pay for those. They don't have an alternative method that just lets the employer keep reporting it. What can occur is that maybe a member is out on temporary duty and then later in their career on non-duty, and they're wondering, why am I being treated different? And it's not about the basic salary. It's about the different two types of purchase service credit. So, now we've almost drilled down to the issue here. So what happened if Dave doesn't return to work and instead retires? So this is the Dave, I should have maybe used different names. This is the non-duty disabled Dave. So yeah, if he was on duty, he may still be able to purchase, he can still purchase the temporary duty disability service credit. But non-duty, he's not eligible to purchase the authorized leave of absence service credit because he did not actually return to work. He was unable to, or just decided he didn't want to, and retired. So this ends up being this kind of catch-22 situation that he's been required by his, I guess, collective bargaining agreement to participate in the buyback program, and therefore he cannot choose to use paid leave for that time. And I don't believe this is all CBAs. So I haven't had a chance to like dig in and get copies of different CBAs and see how many require it versus how many make it optional. But in instances where it's required, he would not be able to use any of his paid leave. He would have to participate in the buyback, and it could create, and then so he's not getting service credit for that time. And then normally, if he returned to work, he'd be able to purchase authorized leave of absence service credit, but he's not doing that. So he's going to have this break in service. And so that's really the issue we were drilling down to here, is people in this specific situation having this gap where they're not able to get service credit reported because of their kind of the competing provisions of their CBA, of basic salary, and the different types of service credit they can purchase. And I hope that made some level of sense. But if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them, or Steve wants to jump in.
So if you could recall, if your memory is really good, and you could recall Jacob's table from his last presentation where he showed all the different types of compensation that are salary. One of the types of compensation that is salary is not cash outs of annual leave or sick leave, but if you actually use them because you're out sick or injured in the case of Dave. So what you've got now is an exception to that rule. So using your sick leave is salary in every case except when you've got a CBA that requires you to use a buyback program, and when you are using it for a non-duty situation, and when you are not able to return to work. And that was the question that came to us. This guy had 3.5 months of service credit that got yanked. And so that was where it first started, and is, again, if it's going to modify the WAC, that was the request, then this should probably be in WAC as well, as opposed to a employer notice. That was the original discussion that we had with DRS last year, and that's kind of where things left off. Similar to the other issue, was the answer was no, and it ended up in the ombudsman bill, and we haven't heard anything since.
Seth, you have an update or anything? I mean, have you guys talked about this, obviously? Or I shouldn't say obviously. Have you talked about it?
Yeah, I would just maybe clarify, or I think part of our concern with putting this specific issue in rule is more of an accounting issue. Like we believe when the leave has been bought back, it has no longer been used. And so I think the point that Steve was making was saying that you've used the leave, so it should still count as basic salary. At that point, we're seeing the leave actually hasn't been used. It's been bought back. And so it isn't basic salary at that point. Nothing's been paid to the person from the employer. One of the points that Jacob made, I think, that I just wanted to clarify as well, is these payments that are coming from other organizations, whether they're coming from, workers' comp, or coming from AFLAC, or I think the new paid family medical leave is another type of pay that is bringing this issue more to light. Those aren't basic salary because they're not being paid from the employer. And so I think one of our questions is the requirement to purchase, to use that Aflac payment, for lack of a better term, to require them to purchase the leave back, is that necessary? Because really, for us, it's an accounting issue. The leave hasn't been used at that point once it's been purchased back. So I think we had talked about putting this in WAC, but I think it wasn't as straightforward as just taking the employer notice and putting it in WAC. There was questions of actually changing what our policy is on that, and our accounting of when leave is purchased back, that leave has no longer been used, so it's not basic salary.
Okay. Questions?
Yeah. So is that current policy, Seth, what you just said?
Yeah, if leave has been purchased back, it should be, the reporting should be taken back out of the system. Except for the example of the temporary duty disability, where it is possible for the employer to say, we're just going to report what their salary would have been as if they purchased the time back. But for not on the job injuries, that leave should be pulled back out of the system because it's back in the person's leave bank. It hasn't been used.
Sure.
And just to make sure I understand, DRS does not have an interest in a person making basic salary and having an Aflac insurance policy on the other side.
Yeah, no issue from our point of view.
Right. Like you said, it's an accounting issue. Okay. Other questions? I noticed one of the slides said 2000 or 17-007. Is that the year 2017? Just, yeah.
Yes, that's the, yep.
How many employer notices are there?
It's a good question. There are different what I would say is different types of employer notices. There are kind of reoccurring employer notices where we're reminding them of something that happens annually, or when your contribution rates change and things like that. An employer notice more like this would be, once or twice a year, but we probably are doing 20 employer notices a year. I can provide you the.
Do you catalog those? Keep those?
Yeah. So there is a history on our website of the kind of the ones like this that are more procedural. The things that are just annual updates, they're only going to show like the most recent year or the most recent 2 years.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Direction. I can't remember which one, number 1 and 2 were now. There we go.
I know, I keep mixing it up on you.
I know you do. You're on my toes. Yeah. Number 1 was no action, and the other one was comprehensive. What's the feeling of the group? Go ahead. Go ahead. Somebody.
Yeah. Somebody?
Yeah.
Is that me?
You.
Oh, very good. I'd like to make a motion for number 2 for comprehensive briefing, being that I don't feel like we have resolution. I don't feel that the employee notice necessarily resolves what we're trying to accomplish here.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second,
All right.
purpose of discussion.
Okay. Motion's been made and seconded, and I will open it for discussion. Go ahead, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Jason, you bring up a good point. I mean, there's so many different integrated aspects to this issue. The fact that we have a comprehensive briefing might dump this back on staff to actually come up with options at the end here to define the issue for us to the point we have a simplistic decision to make, A, B, or C, which would be a benefit to us all. And as a side note, I don't want to answer the question here on this, but I mean, all of a sudden, a different aspect of this kicked in when you talked about compelling people with Aflac policies to reimburse the city, and I'm at a loss where you have an independent insurer and you have the city not a named insured and not paying the premiums on the policy. How can they insert themselves tortiously interfering with contractual relationship between an individual and compel providing that? I'm just saying there's so many different parts to this that are messed up that we're kind of dumping back on you and saying, well, we're refining this for us and come up with some options here to simplify the topic. That's why I'm saying I'll give you my second.
Okay.
Yeah, I would agree. It's an odd way of remunerating the process. But if you take that out and you look at it as the employee is remunerating the employer, for regardless if it's through a, long-term disability insurer or whatever the case is, and you're essentially, what you're doing is you're purchasing service credits, right? Right. Well, that's the CBA though. So that goes back to that employee through that bargaining unit has agreed to that process. So, I mean, that just adds another layer of complexity. But yeah, I'm not sure there's an easy answer. I just don't feel like I have any type of answer. And that's where I feel like more information would be helpful.
Jay?
I tend to agree. I think the fact that none of us are jumping up for one or the other makes me believe that we need more information on this to make a good decision. So I think I fully support the motion.
Thank you. All right, seeing no one else, all those in favor of adopting number 2, please say aye.
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 Opposed? All right, number 2 is adopted. Thank you very much. Thank you, Jacob.
Quick question.
Yes, sir.
With that information on the employer notices, how do we, if we wanted to go back and research some of those are archived, you said that we could go back and pull some of those that would specifically impact LEF?
Yeah, so DRS has them. Where I got that one from is there's a section on their website that lists the employer notices. Like Seth said, it doesn't list all of the employer notices. The more, I guess, immediate ones that aren't relevant, but the ones that, like the 2 I've shared today, are all archived on the website. And there's really not that many to search through.
The challenge is even knowing that they exist. So usually what happens is somebody's got a question about why didn't this get reported as salary? They immediately go to the salary WACs. And there's all the answers to all the different questions, except some of the questions are not answered in WAC. They're answered in an employer notice section on the DRS website that most members in particular, have no idea that it exists and no idea that what's out there could affect their benefit. Process-wise, they didn't have any opportunity to provide any input. None of the stakeholders had any opportunity to provide input into those notices, and those notices are subject to change at any time, unlike WACs. So that was for our, for staff purposes, that was kind of where we started with the request to put it in WAC. There was just a general philosophy. If it affects your member benefit, then it should be in WAC. Then all stakeholders should have the opportunity to participate in it, and it'll be public. Then there's a whole process. It's similar to the legislative process with public hearings and opportunity for input, et cetera. It's administrative rather than legislative, but it's the same process. The employer notice process lacks, it's a very different process, and it lacks any kind of input. And so that was where we started. And there's not really we can't write a bill to compel DRS to write a WAC. So if they're not going to write a WAC, we'll have to come up with options for what that bill would look like. And yeah, we can do that, and bring that back for a comprehensive.
I kind of feel like that's where we're at.
Okay. Yeah.
Because DRS isn't willing to put it in a WAC. I think we need more information to move forward in any direction. And
Mr. Chair, just to follow up on that, I mean, that has been a vulnerability of DRS in operating without WACs having set established published policy out there, going through the rulemaking process, and finding out that maybe they have different people providing different outcomes to different members out there, and having been defined as arbitrary and capricious along the way. The last 15 years worth of litigation indicates that rather clearly. So I think if we're going to attempt to help them establish a WAC that benefits our members, acting in the best interest of our members, we're actually doing them a favor by helping them come up with a policy out here. That's something that should exist in the first place, to Director Nelson's point.
All right, we are looking at number 11 on our list for our agenda today, and we have the option of making a motion to conduct both the nominations and the elections for the chair and the vice chair because we didn't meet in August. And for us to do so, we would need a motion to do such. So is there a motion to conduct our elections, both nominations and elections?
So moved.
Second on that.
Motion's been made and seconded to conduct our nominations and elections today. Is there discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, motion passes. So by rule and by the appropriate procedure, when there's a motion made, you have to call for a nomination 3 times. So at this time, I will open up the nominations for the position of a chair. For the chair.
I nominate Dennis Lawson.
Second.
Okay. Dennis Lawson has been nominated. I'll call again. Is there any other nominations for position of chair? And the third call. Are there any other nominations for position of chair?
Mr. Chair, rather than a vote, I move we move to public claim on this. There's no other nominations.
Correct. Yeah. I was going to get there. All right. It's kind of weird doing my own stuff. Usually we have like an election committee or something, so.
He was just starting here.
Yeah. Bueller, okay.
Bueller.
All right. Since seeing no other, he's got a thing, yeah. Seeing no other nominations by acclamation, I am reelected as chair, and so thank you very much. Open nominations for our vice chair. Open nominations for vice chair.
Mr. Chair, I propose Jason Granneman continue.
Okay. Is there a second? Motion's been seconded for Jason Granneman to serve as our vice chair. Are there any other nominations for vice chair? Are there any other nominations for vice chair? And any others? Seeing none or hearing none, by acclamation, Jason Granneman is reelected as our vice chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And then I think I have, I'm looking, is there any others? That's good.
The third piece usually is the selection of the employer representative to the administrative committee.
Correct.
I don't know, I don't know what the will of the board is on that, whether you're ready to do nominations and elections on that today as well.
Well, I do know that Pat had expressed an interest, but we can go which way the group wants to go. So I'll open up the nominations, I guess, probably.
Would it be appropriate to ask if there's any other interest?
Yeah, I will, as soon as, you want to do that, I guess?
Sure.
Probably.
Yeah.
I'll open up, take nominations for the administrative representative. Are there any nominations? Don't be bashful.
Is this the time to nominate Pat?
Yes, please.
And I nominate Pat.
Thank you, Jay. Is there a second?
Second.
All right, nomination's been made and seconded for Pat McElligott as the administrative representative. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? I'll do the third. Are there any others? Seeing none, by acclamation, Pat McElligott will remain our administrative representative. So, great. 3 things, is that it? Thank you. All right, administrative update.
I'll make this super quick.
Well, I know because you only ate half your sandwich. I saw that. So.
Yeah, I got to get to finishing that sandwich.
Go ahead.
So that is the budget update. I'd be happy to answer any questions, or if there's any real detailed questions about a specific area, we can bring that back for board discussion later. And you can also ask questions offline. The third item is the board's annual financial audit has begun. We're using the state auditor's office again. The expectation is they will have that final report to you no later than your December board meeting this year. I know last year it took a little bit longer than they anticipated and it carried over into January, but the plan is to have it done by December like usual. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. The next meeting of the board is October 25th. By way of reminder, that is the board's strategic planning meeting. You heard some of it from the actuary's office earlier. There's a lot of stuff for you guys to consider about what you want to do for the plan, especially in the area of rate stability and so forth over the next 5 years. We'll be giving you the background information from that. Historically, some of you who've been around since the very beginning, Mark looking at you and Senator looking at you, those have been off-site meetings where things could be a little bit more casual, but it's going to be here. So I apologize for that. It'll look and feel more like a regular board meeting than the historical strategic planning board meetings have in the past. He wears that to regular meetings. If you can't see, he's like a TV newscaster. If you can't see him below the desk, he doesn't count. So no promises. And then that's it, though, for the administrative update. Mr. Chair, my understanding is we received no public comment.
Is there anything else before the board? Any action we want to take?
So,
Go ahead, Senator.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I sense a theme today in our meeting agenda on that. We talked about items 7, 8, 9, that all address an absence of rulemaking to address issues that may have been resolved if they'd been brought to us and asked for authority early on. Nonetheless, there are issues that remained out there. Then issue number 10, where you had possible inconsistent application of policy out there in the total absence of rulemaking. I'm eyeballing this a little bit. I wanted to bring something to the board's attention. And first of all, this meeting's being recorded, right?
Yes.
Okay, so I want Tor to be able to review this after the fact, too, get an eyeball on this, although he's not here today, and possibly Jessica's ombudsman, and definitely you, Steve, as executive director. Talking about rulemaking, they had, in the litigation, 15 years of litigation that is usually been found against DRS that I was speaking to earlier here. There's a 2005 case called Probst, Jeff Probst versus DRS. It had to do with a methodology that DRS employed as to interest compounding on static accounts out there when people transferred from Plan 2 to Plan 3. it evolved over a period of time to where a second appeal on this was Mickey Fowler and Lisa Fowler that was resolved in 2014, setting a specific criteria for this interest computation. The left plan actually has in the banking of distributions when you're employed by a state employer and part of a current retirement system, an account that would apply under this specific Supreme Court decision. I've heard casual conversation that in the last couple of months here, we've had an attempt through a change in legal services manager at DRS to establish a rulemaking policy, a WAC, on this. In the almost 10 years since this decision came out, that they've not chose to establish a policy on this in response to a very direct Supreme Court decision and requirement. I wanted to put on the record and ask staff to clarify some issues that this WAC will address and make sure that it's consistent with the Supreme Court decision that they've waited 10 years to actually implement. The first part is I want them to provide a copy of the WAC, if any, complying with the Fowler appeal. The second is I want to determine if the full rulemaking procedure was followed prior to any WAC being established. And that is like a 6-month formal process, which is interesting that I've heard just in the last couple of months that something is on board or about to happen here, which raises my antenna, old cop stuff here. Third is determine if the WAC substantially complies with the Probst Fowler decision, i.e. the daily compounding requirement versus the quarterly compounding that they use and differentiated from the standard in every other account out there, the normal business use that they had. The fourth is determine what interest rate is being paid on applicable Left 2 accounts as it applies to the Left 2 system. The rest of the systems, I don't care. And the reason I'm asking this is, although it was an unpublished opinion, the transcript of the Court of Appeals, Division 2 in 2014, DRS stated it has set the rate of interest to be credited to PERS Plan 2 member accounts at 5.5% per year compounded quarterly. It was a compounding period that was at issue, not the amount. If they establish that, does that set some sort of a Bockenhouse foundation and protect the interest rate that they were paying up to that point, that they can have enhanced benefits to comply with the Supreme Court decision, or consistent benefits but not a reduction in benefits? This is why I want this recorded. There's some technical issues here. I'd like to have staff provide a briefing on this topic as it applies to any applicable Left 2 account benefit or vesting. This is something I know we already came up with a workload for the year, but I think with everything we're seeing here today, this is rather consistent, which is why I anticipated this issue coming up and something we're going to have that's going to be in front of us here fairly soon. And I hate to have a WAC out there that's easier to anticipate what's going to happen and make sure that it's correct rather than undo something that's already cast.
Yeah, I got 5 things there. I will clarify with you to make sure I understand your 5 asks. And then at least 4 of them I think are fairly straightforward to answer. The Bockenhouse one might be a little bit more challenging, but I'll see what I can learn about that one.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator. Anything else before we look to adjourn? Seeing no one else, entertain a motion.
Move to adjourn.
Motion is made and seconded to adjourn. Discussion? Not seeing any. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, we adjourn till October 25th for our workshop.